Rain never stops falling on Amagakure, not even the day its god died. Nagato was gone. Konan was alone. And an entire village stood between rebuilding itself and disappearing forever, exactly the way everyone outside its walls expected it to. What if Naruto Uzumaki refused to let that happen? What if a promise made in the last honest breath of a dying man became the foundation for something no one, not Konoha, not what was left of Akatsuki, not the 5 great nations themselves, ever saw coming? A fortress built not from conquest, but from trust, freely chosen, between people who had every reason not to trust anyone at all. This is the Vermilion Accord.
Chapter 1. What the rain remembers rain had a memory. That was what the old women in the lower districts of Aimgakure used to tell their children, that the sky above the village never forgot anything that happened beneath it, and that was why it never stopped weeping. Most people treated it as a fairy tale you told to explain away miserable weather. Nobody really believed the sky was keeping score. Then their god died, and it rained harder than anyone alive could remember. Deep inside the tallest spire in the village, past 3 sealed doors and a stairwell that hadn't seen sunlight in over a decade, there was a chamber built for a god to die in. 6 bodies lay scattered around its edges now, arranged like puppets whose strings had all been cut in the same instant. Konan didn't look at them. She had never been able to look at them for long, not since she'd learned exactly what it cost Nagato to keep them moving, to see through 6 sets of borrowed eyes instead of his own ruined ones. She only had eyes for the 7th body. The real one. He was so thin the metal chair seemed to be wearing him rather than the other way around. Chakra rods disappearing into his spine like something out of a story meant to frighten children. But when his eyes found hers, they weren't the flat, concentric rings of a weapon anymore. They were just Nagato's eyes, tired and human, and looking at her the way he used to look at her when they were 3 orphans sharing one blanket in the ruins of a war that wasn't even theirs yet. Konan. His voice barely carried over the rain hammering the tower's plating. "Tell me I did it." "You did it." She kept her own voice level because one of them had to. "Every person that boy's father's technique killed in that village, they're breathing again. Kakashi, all of them." Her hands, resting on the arm of his chair, were not as steady as her voice. Something crossed his ruined face that might have been relief, if relief were a thing that still had the strength to fully arrive. "Good," he said. "Good." The rain filled the silence after that until he spoke again, quieter this time, like he was rationing the words he had left. "He said something to me, before the end." A breath. "The boy. He didn't beg, Konan, and he didn't threaten either, which is more than either of us managed at his age. He just told me flat out that he wasn't going to let this be the end of it. Whatever I believed about how this world works, he said he'd prove it wrong, even if it took him the rest of his life to do it." Nagato's mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be one. "I believed him. I haven't believed anyone like that since Yahiko." Konan felt something twist in her chest at the name, the way it always did. "Belief doesn't rebuild a village," she said, more roughly than she meant to. "No." His hand found hers, the grip so faint she had to hold still to feel it at all. "But it's more than we had yesterday. And it's yours now if you want it. Yahiko's dream never belonged to me, it just borrowed my body for a while, and I made a mess of the loan. It's still out there, waiting for someone to actually build it instead of just believing in it. Maybe it's in that boy. Maybe it's in you. I don't get a vote on that part anymore." His fingers tightened, once the effort of it plainly costing him something. "Just don't let it die alone, Konan. That's the only thing I'd ask you." She wanted to tell him he didn't get to ask her for anything, not now, not like this. That he could save his last requests for a version of this conversation where he wasn't leaving. She didn't say any of it. She just held his hand until it stopped holding hers back, and the rain kept falling the way it always had, indifferent to the fact that a god had just stopped breathing on the other side of the glass. For a long time afterward, Konan didn't move. She sat with the sound of the rain and the 6 empty bodies and the one that mattered, and let herself feel exactly as much of it as she needed to. because she knew, with the flat, practical certainty of someone who had buried two people she loved and was now burying a third, that she would not be allowed this much time again for a while. When she finally stood, she crossed to the narrow window and looked out over what was left of a village. Spires leaning at angles they were never built for, pipeline scaffolding hanging like broken ribs, lights out in whole districts where the generators had finally failed for good. It looked exactly like what it was, a corpse that hadn't been told to stop moving yet. She would not let this village die of loneliness either. Hundreds of kilometers away, under a sky that hadn't finished crying yet either, Naruto Uzumaki stood at the edge of a crater that used to be the center of his village. It was strange, looking at it in daylight. During the fight it had just been ground, something to land on between one desperate idea and the next. Now it was a wound, wide enough to swallow a dozen city blocks, and small figures in Konoha flak jackets were already picking through the rubble at its edges, calling names, sometimes finding people, sometimes not. He didn't hear Kakashi approach until his sensei was already beside him, one arm in a sling weight braced awkwardly on a borrowed cane. Kakashi looked like a man who had been dead less than a day ago, because he had been, which was a sentence Naruto still hadn't figured out how to think about without his stomach doing something complicated. "You're supposed to be resting," Naruto said, because it was easier than saying anything else first. "So are you." Kakashi followed his gaze out over the crater. "You've got that face on, the one you get when you're doing more thinking than a person your age should legally be allowed to do," Naruto almost laughed. "Almost. I told him something, Nagato, right before he did whatever he did to bring everybody back." He turned the words over again, the way he'd been turning them over for hours. "I told him I wasn't going to let it end there, that whatever this peace thing turns into, I'd make sure it actually means something. Not just a nice thing that happened once because a guy felt bad before he died. That's a heavy promise to make a dying man." "Yeah, well..." Naruto shoved his hands in his pockets, looking out at the wreckage of his home, at the people already rebuilding it stone by stone, because that was what you did. That was the only thing you could do. "Guess I should probably figure out how to keep it, huh?" Kakashi was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual lazy edge. "For what it's worth, I think that's the first promise of yours I've heard that I actually believe you might have to bleed for." "Great pep talk, sensei. I try," a pause, "for what it's also worth. I don't think you're wrong to have made it." Naruto didn't answer. He just kept looking at the crater and at the gray clouds finally starting to break apart and drift east, back, he realized with a small, strange jolt, toward the border of Rain Country. That was the day the fighting stopped. The promise, though, was only getting started, and it would take 3 weeks, one very unexpected visitor made entirely of paper, and a decision that would look exactly like treason to almost everyone he loved before Naruto understood precisely what he had signed himself up for. 3 weeks later, it was still raining. Aimgakure had always worn its grief openly, a village built inside a perpetual storm, its skyline a forest of iron spires and pressure pipes designed to survive whether that would have flattened anywhere else. But even by Rain's standards, the village Konan walked through that morning looked less like a shinobi stronghold and more like something the war had simply forgotten to finish killing. Whole districts sat dark, generators long since cannibalized for parts. A checkpoint tower near the eastern gate leaned at an angle steep enough that nobody had bothered manning it in a week. There was nothing left to guard that anyone wanted to take. In the market district, what passed for commerce now was a handful of exhausted vendors trading dwindling supplies for favors, because the currency that used to hold the village together had stopped meaning much of anything once the god who printed it stopped being able to enforce its value. Konan walked through all of it the way she walked through everything now. Spine straight, expression unreadable. Cataloging every failure with the same clinical eye she'd once used to catalog enemy formations. She had an army of exactly one, an economy held together with rationing and stubbornness. and a treasury that consisted of whatever Akatsuki hadn't already spent on weapons this village would never fire again. She was midway through inspecting a collapsed section of the northern aqueduct when the wall beside her turned black and white and grew a face. "Busy morning," said the white half of Zetsu, in the tone of someone remarking on the weather. "Rebuilding without asking permission first. Bold for someone who used to run every decision past a man in a mask." "Tobai wants to know when operations resume," said the black half, with considerably less patience for pleasantries. Konan didn't turn around immediately. She finished examining the crack running through the aqueduct's support column, made a mental note of how many work hours it would cost her to fix, and only then looked at the thing growing out of her wall like a tumor. "They don't," she said. "Aimgakure is no longer affiliated with Akatsuki. You can tell your Tobai that in exactly those words, or in whatever words you think will sting more. I find I don't much care which." The white half tilted its head, an expression of mild, theatrical surprise. "That's a lot of confidence for a village with no shinobi left to speak of. It has exactly as many shinobi as it needs to defend what's actually worth defending." Her tone didn't shift at all. "Was there anything else, or did you crawl all this way just to ask a question you already knew the answer to?" A beat of silence, long enough that Konan understood the real reason for the visit was still coming. "The Rinnegan," the black half said flatly. "Nagato's eyes. Tobai has an interest in their location." Something in Konan went very still, in the particular way that stillness sometimes means the opposite of calm. "The eyes," she said, "are not his. They were never his to ask for, and they certainly aren't his to collect off a corpse the moment it's convenient. He might see it differently. I'm certain he will. He can come discuss it with me directly if he'd like to test how differently I see it in return." The white half of Zetsu smiled, an expression that had never once looked friendly on that face. Villages that stop being useful to people like Tobai have a way of turning into problems that need solving, Konan. Try not to become one of those. It would be such a waste, after all this rebuilding. Then it sank back into the wall the way it had come, leaving nothing behind but a faint discoloration in the stone and a silence that felt, to Konan, considerably louder than the rain. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, filing the exchange away with the same efficiency she'd used for everything else that morning. One more line item on a very long list of problems she did not currently have the resources to solve. She found the children exactly where she expected to. In the half-collapsed shell of what used to be a textile warehouse, 3 floors down from where a bomb had taken the roof off during the invasion. There were 4 of them this week. Ages she guessed at rather than knew for certain, because none of their paperwork had survived whatever happened to their parents. The oldest, a boy who called himself Ren and who had appointed himself the group's unofficial guardian sometime in the last month without anyone asking him to, looked up when she ducked through the gap where a door used to be. "You're late," he informed her with the particular gravity of someone who had decided being in charge meant never smiling first. "I had a visitor." She set down the bag she'd brought, what little food she could spare, plus a few blankets scavenged from an abandoned barracks. "An unpleasant one?" "Was it the plant guy again?" She paused. "You've seen him before." Ren shrugged with the elaborate unconcern of a child who had learned that showing fear only invited more reasons to be afraid. "He came by last month, didn't say much, just looked at everything like he was doing inventory." A beat. "I didn't like him." "Neither do I," Konan said, and meant it more than she usually allowed herself to mean anything out loud. The smallest of the 4, a girl who hadn't offered a name yet, and who Konan had stopped pushing for one, was sitting apart from the others, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve with the single-minded focus small children bring to problems that are actually about something else entirely. Konan sat down near her, not too close, and without really deciding to, began folding a scrap of paper from the bottom of her bag. She didn't have to think about the shape her hands made. They remembered it on their own, the same fold, the same 6-petaled flower, a much younger. much softer man had once made for her out of a torn page, back when she still believed adults kept the promises they made to frighten children. She set the finished flower down where the girl could reach it without having to ask. The girl looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up and held it like it might disappear if she gripped it wrong. Konan watched her do it and felt, not for the first time that month, the particular ache of standing exactly where she'd once stood. Except this time, there was no Juria coming to find her. No third orphan to share the weight with. Just her 4 children who weren't even technically hers, and a village that would not survive on rationing and paper flowers alone, no matter how much either one meant. She thought about Nagato's hand going still in hers. About Yahiko, dead in the mud so many years ago for a dream neither of the boys who loved him had managed to keep intact. About the particular, exhausting arithmetic of pride, how much of it was actually principle, and how much of it was just fear wearing principle as a disguise. Yahiko had never believed strength alone would fix anything. He'd believed in people choosing each other, deliberately, again and again, past every reason not to. That had been the entire dream, underneath all the ideology Nagato eventually built on top of it, not a reign that needed no one, but a reign that finally got to choose who it trusted, instead of having that choice made for it by whoever held the most force. Asking for help wasn't a betrayal of that. Refusing to ask and watching this village die of loneliness out of stubborn pride would be. She made her decision the way she made most of them, quietly, completely, without any visible change in her expression. Somewhere between folding one paper flower and standing back up. She was going to contact Naruto Uzumaki. Not through official channels, which would collapse the whole arrangement before it began. Not by asking Konoha for anything, which she had no standing to do and no interest in doing. Just him. The one loose thread in this entire ruined tapestry that Nagato had, with his last clear breath, told her to trust. That evening, in the privacy of what used to be her office, Konan did something she hadn't done since the war ended. She made herself twice. It was not a technique she used carelessly. Pulling a fully autonomous double from her own body cost chakra she could not easily spare, and left the original feeling, for a few hours afterward, faintly and unpleasantly incomplete, like a book missing a chapter it still remembered writing. But there was no other way to do what needed doing. She could not leave Aimgakure, not with an economy this fragile and a village this exposed, and certainly not to walk openly into Konoha, where her face was still remembered from a war that had ended 3 weeks ago, not 3 decades. And she could not simply send a written message, not for this. Some conversations needed a voice behind them, or they weren't worth having at all, so she gave the clone her voice. Her memory of the conversation with Nagato, word for word. Her judgment, as close to a perfect copy of it as the technique allowed. And she gave it explicit, deliberate limits, enough of her strength to defend itself if it came to that. Nowhere near enough to be mistaken for the real thing by anyone who knew what they were looking at. If this was somehow a trap or a misjudgment on her part, she would lose paper and chakra and pride. Not herself. Aimgakure could not afford to lose herself. The clone unfolded from her shoulder like something shedding a chrysalis. Wings of white and pale blue catching what little light the office had left, and by the time it caught the wind above the tree line outside the village, dusk had already reached the borders of Konoha. 3 days' travel by any conventional method, and considerably less by paper riding a current only Konan knew how to read. Naruto felt the chakra before he saw anything, which was the only reason he didn't put a kunai through it on reflex. It was late, and he was alone in the training ground he still thought of as Team 7, even though none of them had trained there together in months, an old habit. Coming here to think when there was too much to think about and nowhere else that felt like it fit. He'd spent the last hour running Rasengan variations against a line of exhausted shadow clones. Mostly because his body needed something to do while his head worked through the same 3 weeks of memory on an endless loop. He didn't expect the sky above the clearing to fill with drifting white shapes that weren't leaves. They gathered too precisely to be anything natural, hundreds of individual sheets folding into each other midair, faster than his eye could track, until what stood in front of him wasn't paper anymore. It was a woman. Blue hair, an orange flower pinned above one ear, the same face he'd glimpsed once through smoke and collapsing buildings on the worst day of his life. His hand was on a kunai before he'd finished the thought, Konan. "If I wanted you dead," the figure said, and something about the voice was subtly wrong in a way he couldn't name, flatter, maybe, or more careful, like a recording of someone rather than the person themselves. "You would already be dead, Naruto Uzumaki. I'm not here to fight you. I'm not entirely here at all, if we're being precise about it." He didn't lower the kunai. "You're one of her paper things. A clone." An accurate observation for someone who's had exactly one prior encounter with the technique, and that one while several buildings were actively falling on him. The clone's mouth curved briefly into something that might have been approval. "You can put that away. I have a message to deliver, not a fight to pick." He didn't put it away, but he didn't attack either, which he supposed counted as progress. "Then deliver it." The clone told him everything, the state of the village, stripped down to plain facts without any attempt to make the situation sound better or worse than it was. No army. No economy that would survive the season. Children with no parents and no registry to prove they'd ever had any. A withdrawal from Akatsuki that had bought Aimgakure exactly one enemy fewer and left it standing directly in the path of every other one. "She's not asking Konoha for anything," the clone said. "She knows that door doesn't open, not this soon, not for a village that spent the last decade being a weapon aimed at the 5 nations. She's asking you, specifically you, not as a shinobi of the leaf and not as whatever the history books are already starting to call you after pain. Just you." Naruto's jaw tightened. "Why me?" "Because Nagato told her what you said to him, at the end." The clone's expression didn't change, but something in the flat, careful voice sharpened, just slightly, into something closer to a genuine question. "He said you told him you wouldn't let this be the end of it, that whatever you believed about breaking cycles that have run for generations, you'd prove it, even if it cost you the rest of your life to do it." A pause, longer than the last one. "I want to know if that was true. Or if it was just something true enough to say to a dying man, the way people say all kinds of things they don't intend to spend a lifetime paying for." The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Naruto felt his throat go tight, because he remembered saying it, remembered meaning it, in the crater, with Nagato's tired eyes finally looking almost peaceful for the first time since the fight started. And he had spent every day since telling himself it counted for something, without once being asked to actually prove it. "I'm not asking you to abandon your village," the clone continued before he could find an answer. "I'm asking you not to let this be one more promise Rain gets to watch die of convenience. That's all this village has ever gotten from people stronger than it, promises with very small print. Nagato believed you might be different. I intend to find out if he was right." For a long moment, the only sound in the clearing was rain starting to fall, light, almost gentle, nothing like the storm that never stopped hundreds of kilometers south, but enough to make Naruto look up at the sky like it might have an answer he didn't. He thought about the council, about how something like this would look on paper before it ever got the chance to look like anything else. A Konoha shinobi, quietly aiding the sovereign leader of a village that had spent years trying to kill him and the people he loved, without informing his own Hokage first. He thought about Danzo, whom he'd met exactly twice and disliked both times with an intensity he usually reserved for people who hurt his friends. He thought about how easy it would be for this to look, to absolutely anyone back home, like the exact shape of treason. He thought about all of that, and answered anyway with the only thing that had ever actually decided anything for him. "Tell her I'm listening," he said. "That's not a yes." "Not yet, but it's not a no either, and you can tell her I don't say maybe to things I don't mean to follow through on." The clone studied him for a moment longer, then inclined her head, an oddly formal gesture for something made of folded paper. "I'll tell her exactly that." She came apart in the same instant, hundreds of sheets scattering upward into the darkening sky and vanishing into the rain, leaving Naruto alone in the clearing with a decision he hadn't officially made yet, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that some quiet part of him already had. He didn't say yes that night, but walking back toward the lights of a village that had no idea what he was about to do to protect it, Naruto Uzumaki already knew which answer was going to win. Naruto had solved a lot of problems with shadow clones before. He'd used them to cover missed training sessions, to plow through more D-rank chores in an afternoon than any sane person should have to do in a week, to fill an entire clearing with sparring partners so he could burn through a taijutsu drill 20 times faster than anyone should reasonably be able to. He had never used them to run 2 lives at once. But 3 days after a woman made of paper told him a village was dying and asked whether his promise to a dead man had an expiration date, he was fairly sure that was exactly what he was about to do. The math wasn't even the hard part. His chakra reserves had stopped being a normal person's reserves a long time ago. Kakashi called it excessive. Jiraiya used to call it obscene, and Naruto had privately started thinking of it as the one advantage he had that nobody could train, steal, or talk him out of. Splitting off a handful of clones and sending them 3 days' travel in one direction cost him less, proportionally, than most Jonin would spend on a single C-rank mission. He'd trained with 1,000 clones at once at Mount Myaboku and still had chakra to spare afterward. The hard part was that when a shadow clone dispersed, its memories came home. All of them, which meant that whatever his clones did in Aimgakure, whoever they talked to, whatever they saw, whatever mistakes they made, he was going to live through it personally, second-hand and usually all at once, the moment each one popped. He decided he could live with that. He decided, somewhat less comfortably, that he could live with not telling anyone about it either. Not because he wanted to lie to Bachan, exactly, but because there was a real difference between lying and simply not volunteering information nobody had thought to ask for yet. It was a distinction he suspected wouldn't survive contact with Shikamaru for very long. He'd worry about that when it happened. The mission desk, as it turned out, didn't ask very many questions of a genin who wanted extra solo training leave in the weeks after an S-rank invasion. Especially not with Tsunade still unconscious in the hospital wing after whatever it had cost her to hold the village together, and Shizune drowning under enough paperwork for 3 Hokage. Half the shinobi roster was doing some version of the same thing anyway, working out things they couldn't work out standing still, and Shizune signed off on his 3rd request that week without so much as glancing up from the stack of casualty reports still piled on her desk. "Try not to level any more forests," she said. "No promises," Naruto said, and meant it about several things at once. On his way out of the tower, he passed Danzo in the corridor, bandaged arm, cane, that single visible eye that always seemed to be running arithmetic nobody else was invited to see the result of. They didn't speak. They never really did. But the old man's gaze lingered half a second longer than comfortable, and Naruto found himself walking a little faster than usual until he was back out in the sun. That night, in the training ground he still thought of as Team 7, he made a dozen shadow clones, sent 4 of them east toward Rain Country, and put the rest to work on chores around Konoha he'd been putting off for a week. It felt, for one strange moment, exactly like something he would have done for a prank 2 years ago. It did not feel like a prank now. He thought, briefly and with some nostalgia, of the first time he'd ever used the technique for something other than exactly what it was built for, 1 clone to distract Chuchai, 1 to steal an extra bowl of ramen off the counter, and getting caught anyway because he'd never quite worked out how to make a shadow clone stop grinning like an idiot. He was several years and a few hundred borderline felonies wiser now. The grin, unfortunately, hadn't improved much. The clone that touched down on the outskirts of Aimgakure 3 days later had never seen the real thing up close, And its first thought, which meant Naruto's first thought, delivered secondhand and several nights early, was that Konoha's crater had nothing on this. Konoha's wound was recent. Raw. A single afternoon's damage that the whole village was already racing to close over. Aimgakure's wounds were layered, some fresh, some clearly years old, patched over so many times in so many places that the patches themselves had started failing. Generation after generation of damage, nobody had ever had the resources to fully repair. Towers leaned at angles no architect would have signed off on. Pipeline scaffolding had rusted through in a dozen places, weeping thin trails of water down walls already soaked black by rain that never stopped falling. It didn't look like a village that had lost a war recently. It looked like a village that had been losing the same war for longer than anyone currently alive in it had been born. The clone didn't get more than 30 feet past the outer perimeter before someone put a kunai to its throat. Leaf headband. The man holding the kunai had a voice that had clearly practiced sounding bored about violence a long time ago. He was older than the shinobi Naruto usually crossed blades with gray threading through what was left of his hair, a puckered scar running from his jaw down under his collar, a left arm that ended just past the elbow in a stump wrapped so neatly it had clearly stopped being new a long time ago. "You've got some nerve walking in the front gate. I'm not here to fight," the clone said, hands raised, chakra held carefully in check. "Konan's expecting me, or expecting a version of me anyway. It's complicated. Everything about this village is complicated." The kunai didn't move. "You know what's not complicated? My little brother. Age 9. Buried under what used to be the East Quarter because a Leaf squad decided this village was worth burning during a war neither of us started. That's not complicated at all. That's the simplest math I know." The clone didn't flinch and didn't argue because it carried enough of Naruto in it to know that arguing wouldn't make this better. And because some part of it already understood that every word of this exchange was coming home the moment it dispersed, whether either of them liked it or not. "I can't fix that," it said quietly. "I'm not going to pretend I can, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you Leaf's hands are clean, because I don't actually know that they are. All I can tell you is I wasn't on that squad, and I wasn't born yet when it happened. I didn't come here to be forgiven for something I didn't do. I came because somebody asked for help, and I told her I'd give it." The man studied him for a long moment, close enough that the clone could see exactly how much restraint it was taking him not to finish the motion he'd started. Pretty words for a Leaf brat. "Isamu!" Konan's voice arrived from somewhere above them, cutting through the standoff before it could become something neither man could walk back. She landed without a sound, paper drifting down around her like the world's most understated entrance. "Let him go. He's mine to vouch for, and if he turns out to be a mistake, he'll be mine to clean up." Isamu, the clone filed the name away, the same way it filed away everything a threat told it without meaning to, lowered the kunai a fraction, though he didn't sheath it. "You're vouching for a Leaf shinobi. In this village, after everything." "I'm vouching for a promise Nagato believed in with the last honest breath he had," Konan said, and something in her voice made even Isamu go quiet. "You don't have to trust him. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to watch him, the way you'd watch anyone new with a weapon in a village this fragile, and to judge him on what he actually does instead of what headband he happens to be wearing. That's all I'm asking of anyone right now. It's all any of us can afford." Isamu's jaw worked for a moment before he finally, grudgingly, put the kunai away. "Fine, he works. He earns it same as anyone. First sign he's here for anything other than what you say he's here for, I put him in the ground myself, and I won't apologize for it after." "If that day comes," the clone said before it could stop itself, "you won't need to apologize. I'll have earned it." Something flickered across Isamu's scarred face that wasn't quite approval, but was at least the distant cousin of it. He turned without another word and walked off toward the district he'd apparently appointed himself responsible for. "He lost more than a brother," Konan said, once he was out of earshot. "He lost the version of this village that existed before all of it. Most of the people old enough to remember that version did. She looked at the clone the way she'd looked at Naruto through her paper avatar 3 nights ago, straight through the borrowed face to whatever was actually behind it. You should know what you're walking into before you decide how much of yourself to spend on it. I know exactly what I'm walking into, the clone said. Where do you want us working first? That night, half a world away, lying in his own bed with the memory of a kunai at his throat freshly settled into a body that had never actually been there, Naruto found himself thinking less about Isamu's anger and more about the particular shape of it. He knew grief that curdled into anger. He'd spent a long time, before Uruka-sensei, before Kakashi, before any of it, mistaking the ache of having nobody left to lose for a personality of his own. Isamu hadn't done anything wrong by hating a headband on sight. He'd just done what grief does to a person who never got the chance to put it down properly. Naruto didn't have a jutsu for fixing that. He wasn't sure one existed. All he had was a length of pipe, a pair of hands, and however many days it took before actions started outweighing history. He decided that would have to be enough, because it was all he had. They started with the aqueduct, because Konan asked for it directly, and because shadow clones turned out to be extremely good at the specific, unglamorous work of clearing collapsed stonework one bucket chain, and one length of salvaged pipe at a time. Isamu, it turned out, had opinions about which jobs a leaf shadow clone should be trusted with, and every one of his early assignments involved labor with no possible tactical or informational value, hauling rubble, scrubbing algae out of cracked cisterns. The kind of work he'd have handed to the newest, least trusted genin in any ordinary village. If it was a test, and Naruto was fairly sure it was, the clones passed it by simply not noticing it was a test at all. Work was work. Nobody complained about the dignity of a job when the job needed doing. By the third day, the original 4 clones had grown closer to a dozen, reinforcements slipping east every night once Naruto was sure nobody in Konoha was tracking his sudden enthusiasm for solo training a little too closely. A few of the crew got reassigned partway through to shore up a support tower, leaning badly enough that the next real storm might have taken an entire block of half-repaired housing down with it. Nobody assigned the last one anywhere in particular, which was how it ended up back at the half-collapsed textile warehouse 3 floors down from a hole in the roof that had been letting rain in for 3 weeks straight. The real test came on the 5th day, and it didn't come from Isamu at all. A support strut on the leaning tower gave way faster than anyone had accounted for old metal shearing through decades of rust in the space of one wet afternoon, dropping a section of scaffolding 3 stories toward a work crew that included, that particular hour, 2 Rain genin who couldn't have been much older than Ren. One of the clones was closer than it had any right to be. Chakra already spent from a full morning of hauling stone, and it didn't stop to do the math before it moved. It got both genin clear with a hand on each collar and took the falling strut across its own shoulders instead. Exactly enough force to end it, a plume of smoke where a person had been standing a half-second before, and 2 shaken teenagers sitting in the mud, alive, staring at the space where their rescuer used to be. Naruto felt that one differently than the others. Getting hit hurt the same whether the body doing the hurting was real or borrowed, and for one disorienting second that night, he was fairly sure he'd actually died, before his own memory caught up and sorted out which version of events belonged to him and which belonged to Smoke and Chakra. Isamu was the one who hauled both genin upright and checked them over for injuries neither of them had. He didn't say anything about it to the other clones working the site. But the next morning, for the first time since any of them had arrived, he handed out an assignment that required actual judgment instead of just a strong back, and didn't stand over anyone's shoulder while it got done. The bandits came on the 6th night, the way scavengers always do once word starts spreading that something wounded might finally be worth approaching. A dozen or so armed opportunists, not shinobi exactly, but not harmless either, testing the village's eastern perimeter under cover of the ever-present rain to see how much of Aimgakure's old reputation had died in that crater along with its god. They found out quickly enough. Isamu met the first wave personally, 3 genin at his back, and a temper that had clearly been waiting all week for something more satisfying to hit than rubble. 2 of the clones on perimeter duty that night intercepted the second wave before it ever reached the wall. And if the intruders were confused about why a leaf-headbanded shinobi was defending a rain border at all, none of them survived the encounter with enough curiosity left to ask about it. It wasn't a battle, it barely qualified as a skirmish. But when it was over, Isamu found a clone standing, unasked, at the exact stretch of wall that had been weakest for the longest. "You didn't have to do that," Isamu said. "It wasn't quite gratitude, it was closer to confusion." "Wasn't gonna let some scavengers undo a week of pipe fixing," the clone said. "Would have been a waste of a pretty good roof, too." Isamu didn't laugh exactly, but something in his shoulders loosened a fraction that hadn't loosened all week, and he didn't argue when the clone fell into step beside him on the walk back to the gate. Ren was on the warehouse floor when the clone climbed through the gap where a door used to be, back against a support beam, wearing the expression of someone who considered himself the building's official security detail. "You're one of the new ones," he said in a tone that made clear this was not automatically a point in the clone's favor. "The plant guy's replacement. Definitely not the plant guy," the clone said. "Different problem entirely. I heard you've got a leak. We've got a whole missing roof. It's not really a leak so much as an open invitation." Ren watched the way a kid watches an adult who hasn't yet proven they're worth the energy of trusting. "What do you want for it?" "Nothing. Everybody wants something." "I wanted to fix a roof before it rained on somebody smaller than you tonight," the clone said, already unspooling a length of salvaged sheeting it had picked up from the tower project. "That's it! That's the whole want." Ren didn't say anything else for a while, which the clone had learned over 3 days of borrowed memory and second-hand instinct was about as close to permission as the kid handed out. It took the better part of an hour, working alone, to patch the worst of the gap well enough to hold through a storm, not a real repair. Nothing that would last the season, but enough that 4 kids wouldn't wake up soaked through the next time the sky decided to remind everyone it hadn't forgiven anybody yet. When it finished, Ren was still watching, arms crossed, doing an admirable job of looking unimpressed. "It's not perfect," the clone said. "Nothing here is." Ren uncrossed his arms just slightly. "It's better, though." "Yeah," the clone agreed. "That's usually where you have to start." The littlest of the 4 had watched the whole repair from behind a stack of crated fabric that had survived the roof collapse by sheer luck. When the clone finally packed up its tools, she came out just far enough to be seen, holding the paper flower Konan had folded for her 3 weeks earlier like it had grown roots into her hand. "Sora," she said, to nobody in particular, or maybe to everybody at once. The clone looked at her, and at Ren, who looked equal parts surprised and protective, like he hadn't been entirely sure she had a voice at all. "It's a good name," the clone said, and left it at that, because some things didn't need more than 4 words to be worth saying. Konan watched the aqueduct come back online from the shattered window of what used to be her office. Water running clean and cold through pipes that had been dry since before the invasion. A woman 2 streets over sobbing into a bucket like it was the best thing that had happened to her all year. A knot of children turning a leaking valve into a game before anyone told them to stop. It was such a small thing. It was, she thought, watching it, possibly the first small thing this village had been allowed to have in longer than she could easily calculate. She didn't let herself hope out loud. She had learned a long time ago what hoping out loud cost. But she let herself feel it quietly, standing alone at a broken window in the rain, and for the first time in 3 weeks the weight in her chest eased by some fraction too small to name and too real to dismiss. Hundreds of kilometers away, Naruto felt the same afternoon secondhand, the memory arriving all at once and knocking the taste clean out of a bowl of ramen he'd stopped paying attention to. the groan of old stones settling into a repair that would actually hold. The first cough of water through a pipe that had been dry for 3 weeks. A woman crying into a bucket. A game with a leaking valve that nobody had the heart to end early. It wasn't a parade. Nobody threw a festival over plumbing. But sitting alone at a Konoha ramen stand with broth going cold in front of him, Naruto understood that this was the part nobody put in the stories about heroes. Not the fight. This. The plumbing, he decided he didn't mind that at all. "You've been weird all week," Sakura said, sliding onto the stool beside him with the easy familiarity of someone who'd known him too long to bother being subtle about it. "Weirder than usual. I mean, you're doing the thing where you smile but your eyes are somewhere else." "I'm just tired," Naruto said, which had the considerable advantage of being completely true. "Extra training. Kakashi-sensei's got me running myself into the ground. Kakashi-sensei's on medical leave with one working arm. Extra training I assigned myself then." He pushed the smile up a notch, the way he'd been practicing all week without quite admitting to himself that was what he was doing. "You know me, gotta get stronger, can't let a peace treaty make me soft." Sakura studied him a beat longer than he was entirely comfortable with, the particular assessing look she'd inherited from spending too much time around Tsunade. But whatever she saw, or didn't see, she let it go for now. With a small shrug, and an order for the same ramen he was pretending to enjoy. He filed that away too, somewhere between everything else his clones had sent home that week. He was not as good at this as he needed to be, and he had exactly no idea what he'd do the day someone finally got good enough to notice. Under the eastern district of Aimgakure, in a stretch of tunnel nobody living had walked through in years, something pale and fungal had been growing quietly in the dark for a long time, patient in the specific, mindless way that only something grown rather than born can afford to be. It had been planted there back when the village still answered to a different set of masters. One more sensor among dozens scattered through a network that used to belong entirely to Akatsuki, left running long after the organization that planted it had stopped paying much attention to this particular corner of the world. It had not registered anything worth relaying in a very long time. That changed the night a chakra signature passed within range of it that matched nothing in its accumulated records of Aimgakure's shinobi, bright and vast, and carrying underneath it a low, resonant hum that its borrowed memory recognized from a very specific set of instructions concerning a boy, a fox, and a debt Akatsuki had never actually written off. It could not think, in any sense a person would recognize as thinking. But it could react, and it did, folding the signature into a pattern, compressing the pattern into something that could travel, and sending it outward through channels that had nothing to do with roads or messengers, toward someone very far away who was about to find this particular piece of news extremely interesting. Somewhere with no rain at all, something that had been waiting a long time finally had a reason to start paying attention to Aimgakure again. For 11 days, the arrangement had worked better than either of them had any right to expect. Water ran in 3 more districts than it had a month ago. The eastern wall hadn't seen a scavenger since the night Isamu stopped needing convincing. Ren left the warehouse door open during the day now instead of barricading it, which Konan had learned to recognize as the closest thing to trust the boy was currently capable of. Even Isamu's reports had started sounding less like complaints and more like status updates. By the exhausted standards Aimgakure had been living under for years, it was something close to good news. It was Isamu who ended that, walking straight into her office instead of stopping her in a corridor, which was, in its own quiet way, a bigger vote of confidence than anything he'd said out loud in 11 days. "Scouts," he said, dropping a hand-sketched map onto a desk. "Iwa colors, or close enough. 3 separate sightings along the eastern ridge in the last 4 days, always gone before anyone could get close enough to confirm." His jaw tightened. "They're not here to trade. Villages that still have teeth don't get scouted quietly. Villages that used to have teeth do." Konan studied the map without touching it, the way she studied most things that frightened her, carefully, and from a small, controlled distance. "How confident are you?" "Confident enough that I moved 2 more genin to the Eastern Watch this morning. Not confident enough to wake the whole village over it yet." He hesitated, which was rare enough for him that it was almost its own piece of information. "We survived on reputation for years before any of this. Nobody wanted to find out what was actually left of Aimgakure once Pain stopped answering for it. That reputation's got maybe a season left before somebody tests it properly. When they do, pipes and patrols won't be what saves us." It was, Konan thought once he'd gone, the most useful thing Isamu had said to her since he'd stopped threatening to kill her newest ally on sight. Within the hour, she'd sent for the clone. "I didn't ask you here to fix pipes forever," she said, once it had been redirected from that morning's labor detail to her office instead. "Aimgakure can survive a bad winter on pipes and stubbornness. It cannot survive a Baito, or whatever the 5 nations decide to do once they finish deciding whether we're harmless or worth conquering. I need to know if what you carry and what I carry can become something neither of us has alone, and if it can't, I need to know that too before I've spent a season believing in something that isn't real." The reasoning, when the clone turned it over, actually held up. Paper burned, paper cut. However many sheets Konan produced, each one was only ever as tough as paper got to be, and a fire-natured opponent with any real skill could turn an entire battlefield of her jutsu to ash in the time it took to finish a hand seal. Naruto had the opposite problem: chakra enough to reinforce a mountain, no elegant way to put it anywhere delicate without breaking whatever he touched. On paper, the idea, not the material, combining the two sounded almost obvious. Her structure, his weight behind it. A fortress that could bend instead of just standing there waiting to be knocked down. "Sounds simple enough," the clone said. It was not simple enough. They set up in the largest room. Konan's tower still had a roof over. What used to be a war room, big enough that a failed experiment wouldn't immediately endanger anyone standing nearby. Isamu installed himself in the doorway without being asked, arms crossed, radiating the particular patience of a man waiting to be proven right. Neither of them told him to leave. Konan unfolded a section of blank paper roughly the size of a shield, the motion so practiced it looked less like ninjutsu and more like breathing, and held it steady in the space between them. "You should understand what you're actually reinforcing," she said, before either of them moved further. "This isn't paper with chakra sitting behind it like a coat of paint. Every sheet is an extension of my own chakra network, shaped and hardened by will as much as by hand, which is why it responds the way living tissue responds, and why it fails the way living tissue fails, instead of simply breaking the way something inert would. Push your chakra into it, and you're not reinforcing a wall. You're grafting something onto a nervous system that already belongs to me. If this is going to work, it needs to feel like cooperation to both of us, not force applied from outside. My chakra will resist being overridden just as surely as a body resists a splinter." "Slowly, then," Naruto's clone said. "Tell me if something feels wrong before it becomes a problem." It became a problem in about 4 seconds. The clone pushed chakra into the sheet the way it pushed chakra into everything, directly, generously, the same approach that had never once failed to work when the goal was simply more power. For a fraction of a second, the paper seemed to hold, its edges glowing faintly gold. Then it came apart entirely, not tearing so much as unraveling, hundreds of individual fibers separating from each other in a spray that looked, for one absurd moment, like snow. Konan wasn't cut. She was fast enough to pull her hand back a half-second before the physical disintegration reached her fingers. But something in her expression flickered all the same, a wince, quick and covered almost as fast as it appeared. The look of someone who just felt something tear that had nothing to do with skin. The shield-sized sheet that had cost her the better part of a minute's focused chakra to produce was now confetti drifting across her office floor. And the look she gave the clone afterward was not encouraging. Isamu, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed in a way that suggested he'd been expecting exactly this, didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I didn't even use a real jutsu, the clone said. I was just pushing chakra. That's what concerns me, Konan said, watching the last of the scraps settle. If that's what your chakra does when you're not trying to cut anything, I'd like to know what it does when you are. They tried again an hour later, after Naruto had spent most of it sitting cross-legged on Konan's floor with his eyes closed, trying to remember exactly what Kakashi had taught him about wind nature manipulation, so he could do the opposite of all of it. Where wind chakra wanted to sharpen and separate, he tried to make his chakra go soft, and even instead, more like the flat, featureless push he used to walk up trees or stand on water. It was, he reflected, a genuinely strange kind of effort, trying to make a part of himself less like itself on purpose. This time the paper didn't shred. It also didn't do anything else. Konan lifted the reinforced sheet, turned it over once, and folded it experimentally. And it split cleanly along the fold, like something left out to dry for a decade. All the fluid, responsive quality that made her jutsu what it was gone, replaced by a flat, lifeless stiffness that shattered instead of bending. Better, Konan said, in the tone of someone being generous. It stopped attacking me, it also stopped being paper. There was, briefly, a third idea. Sage mode, natural energy instead of his own chakra, something that wasn't nature-typed in the usual sense because it wasn't entirely his to begin with. For about 90 seconds, it actually looked like progress. The sheet Konan reinforced with borrowed toad chakra held together under a firm tug, then a hard one, then something close to what an actual kunai strike would deliver. Then Naruto's concentration slipped for exactly as long as it took to feel his own face start stiffening in a way he'd been warned about exactly once, and clearly hadn't taken seriously enough. And the experiment ended with him spending 20 humiliating minutes trying to convince his own jaw to stop turning faintly amphibian, while Konan watched with the expression of someone recalculating several assumptions about how reliable this particular tool was actually going to be. It works, she said once he could talk again without a lisp. For about a minute and a half, and only if nothing interrupts you, and only if you can hold still long enough to keep gathering the energy in the first place, which, respectfully, does not describe you in the middle of a fight. Yeah, Naruto muttered, still checking his own cheekbones with both hands to make sure they'd gone back to normal. Isamu, who had drifted back to the doorway sometime in the last hour, made a sound that might, on a more generous day, have been mistaken for a laugh, and didn't bother denying it when Konan glanced at him. A fourth idea took longer to fail, which somehow made the failure worse. Konan tried wrapping the reinforcement in layers instead of feeding it straight through, folding a buffer of her own unaltered chakra between the wind and the working paper, the way a person wraps something that bites before picking it up. For nearly a full minute, it held. The reinforced section took a solid strike from a training kunai without so much as fraying, and for just long enough that both of them let themselves consider believing it, it looked exactly like the answer they'd spent all afternoon chasing. Then the buffer gave out from the inside, the way a levee fails, not all at once, but in a spreading line of small tears that raced outward from the center until the whole sheet came apart in the same slow, unraveling collapse as the very first attempt, just delayed long enough to feel like a considerably worse kind of disappointment. It's not gentler, Konan said, watching the last of it settle over her desk. It's just patient. By the time that fourth failure finished failing, Isamu had stopped bothering to hide his opinion. This is what we're spending daylight on, he said, to no one in particular, in the particular not-quite question he'd perfected over 11 days of watching a leaf shinobi try to prove himself useful. Paper tricks. Nobody asked you to watch, Konan said, sharper than she usually allowed herself to be. Somebody should, since apparently nobody's asking whether this is worth the paper it's burning through. He didn't wait for a response before letting himself out, which might have been tact or might have been cowardice, and the clone genuinely couldn't tell which. The silence he left behind was worse than the interruption had been. "He's not wrong to ask," Konan said, after a moment, something in her voice gone thin in a way it hadn't been all afternoon. "Every sheet I burn through today is chakra I don't have to spare tomorrow. Every hour we spend on something that doesn't work is an hour closer to whoever's watching us deciding we're either harmless enough to ignore or dangerous enough to end." She looked at the drifting scraps of her fourth failed attempt, not at him. "Maybe Nagato was wrong about you. Maybe this was always going to be more talk, dressed up as something else." It landed exactly where she'd aimed it, which the clone suspected was the point. For a second it didn't say anything, because the real Naruto, 3 days and one very bad memory away from feeling all of this at once, hadn't decided yet whether he was angrier or just hurt, and the two had an unhelpful habit of looking identical from the outside. "That's not fair," he said finally, "and you know it. I didn't decide wind cuts things. Nobody decided that. That's just what chakra is, and you're mad at me for something a leaf falling off a tree could have told you before we even started." He made himself stop, made himself actually look at her instead of just reacting, and something in the exhausted set of her shoulders caught up with him half a beat late. "You're not actually mad about the paper, though, are you?" Konan didn't answer right away, which, from a woman who usually had an answer prepared 3 moves in advance, was its own kind of answer. "No," she admitted finally. "I'm not." She set down what was left of the ruined sheet with more care than the scraps deserved, an old habit that had outlived whatever purpose it once served. "I have 4 children who have started expecting the water to work and the roof to hold and the wall to stay standing. I have a man outside that door who lost his brother to people who looked like you, and who chooses, every single day, to trust me instead of his own memory of what people who look like you are capable of. And I have exactly one plan for keeping any of that safe when someone stronger finally decides we're worth taking seriously. And today it turned into confetti 4 separate times." She exhaled, something that wasn't quite a laugh. "I built an entire philosophy once around the idea that you don't get to control everything, that you make the best choice available and live with what happens. I seem to have misplaced most of it sometime in the last month." "You didn't misplace it," Naruto said. "You're just tired of it being true." He sat down across from her without waiting to be invited, the same way he'd learned to sit down next to people who needed someone to just be there instead of fixing anything. "I get it more than you'd probably guess," he said. "I've got a promise of my own I still haven't kept. Different kind. Still keeps me up some nights, wondering if I'm ever going to be strong enough to actually get there, or if I'm just going to keep almost getting there until it's too late." He shrugged, like the admission cost him something he'd decided was worth spending. "So yeah, I get being scared the thing you're counting on might not hold. Doesn't mean you stop building it, just means you're allowed to be scared while you do." Something in her expression eased, not into warmth exactly, but into something adjacent to it. "That might be the most perceptive thing you've said all week." For a moment neither of them said anything else. Outside, the rain kept doing what it always did, indifferent to confetti or philosophy or 2 people quietly deciding not to be enemies after all. "I have my moments." A pause. "For what it's worth, I don't think today was wasted. I think we were just asking the wrong question." "We kept trying to make my chakra stop being wind," the clone said, working through it out loud the way its real counterpart always did his best thinking, badly, in front of an audience, and somehow arriving somewhere useful anyway. "But that's like asking water to stop being wet so it can reinforce a fire. It's not a control problem. It's not something I can just try harder at. Wind cuts because that's its whole job. It doesn't know how to not do that any more than your paper knows how to stop being paper." Konan considered that, turning it over with the same clinical patience she gave everything. "Then we need a different chakra, one that doesn't have a job that conflicts with mine." "Yeah." The clone went quiet for a second, because the real Naruto, arriving at his own conclusion 3 days early and several hundred kilometers away, had just realized exactly where that thought led, and didn't entirely love it. I think I might actually have one of those. I've just never asked to borrow it on purpose before. Konan didn't ask what he meant. Something in the careful, deliberate way he'd said it told her she already knew, and that it wasn't a conversation this particular version of him was equipped to finish. Then go ask, she said. Properly. Not through paper and borrowed memory, you, Naruto Uzumaki, in a room with whatever it is you're about to knock on the door of. A beat. I'll have more paper by the time you're ready to try again. Try not to keep it waiting too long. Neither of us has that kind of time to spare. He spent the rest of that day in Konoha, only half paying attention to it. A D-rank escort mission that should have taken an hour took closer to 2, mostly because he kept catching himself replaying Conan's voice. Maybe Nagato was wrong about you, in the gaps between conversations, turning it over like a wound that wasn't there yet, or was, and he just hadn't found where it actually hurt. Uruka caught him staring at nothing outside the mission office and asked if he was all right. Naruto told him he was just tired, the same answer he'd been handing out for 2 weeks straight, and was mildly unsettled by how easily it came out now, like a technique he'd trained without ever meaning to. That night, in his own apartment with the lights off, and the memory of confetti and Conan's exhausted honesty still settling into place, Naruto sat cross-legged on his bed and did something he generally went out of his way to avoid doing on purpose. He closed his eyes, breathed out until the noise of the day thinned to almost nothing and reached inward. Past the ordinary ache of a long day, down toward the familiar, uncomfortable pressure that lived at the center of him, coiled and enormous and never quite asleep. The place he landed, the way he always did, looked nothing like his apartment and everything like the inside of a drainage system that had given up pretending to be anything else. Ankle-deep water stretching into corridors with no visible end. Pipes overhead dripping in a slow, patient rhythm that had nothing to do with any weather outside. He'd hated this place the first time he'd seen it, mostly because it reminded him he was carrying something enormous around inside a body that had never once asked for the privilege. He didn't hate it anymore, exactly. He just respected it, the way a person respects anything large enough to end them on a bad day. At the far end of the corridor, where the water ran deepest, a seal the size of a door held back a darkness with its own kind of gravity, pulling at his attention whether he wanted to look or not. He'd knocked on this particular door exactly twice before in his life, both times because he'd had no other choice left. This was the first time he'd done it on purpose, with nothing forcing his hand except a promise he'd made to a dying man and a village that couldn't afford to wait for him to work up the nerve. I need to ask you something, he thought, into the dark. For a long moment, nothing answered except the drip of water somewhere behind him. Then something vast and old shifted, behind bars stamped with a seal that had kept 9 tails worth of hatred contained for as long as Naruto had been alive. And a voice like gravel dragged across a riverbed rolled up out of the silence, equal parts curiosity and contempt. You want something from me? 2 enormous, slitted eyes opened in the dark behind the bars, catching what little light there was and throwing it back red. This should be entertaining. Yeah, Naruto said, holding his ground the way he'd trained himself to over 2 years and more bad nights than he liked counting. I do. And before you say no just to watch me squirm, hear me out first. It's not for me. Something that might have been a low, rumbling laugh moved through the water at his feet. Everything you've ever asked me for has been not for you. It has, without exception, still ended up being for you. A pause, thoughtful in the specific, dangerous way that meant it was actually considering the question rather than dismissing it outright. Go on, then. Talk. I have nowhere else to be, and apparently neither do you. Naruto took a breath and didn't let himself lose his nerve. Okay, he said. Here's the deal. The water was still cold around his ankles, the seal still loomed at the end of the corridor, and 2 enormous red eyes were still watching him with the specific patience of something that had nowhere else to be. Okay, Naruto said. Here's the deal. He laid it out the way he'd rehearsed it walking home from the mission office. Rain, Konan, the promise. The wind that wouldn't stop cutting no matter how hard he tried to make it behave. The fact that everything he and Konan had tried on their own had already failed in 4 increasingly humiliating ways. I need chakra that doesn't cut, doesn't scorch things by accident, just chakra. Yours, on purpose this time, not just whatever leaks through when I'm about to die. Kurama was quiet long enough that Naruto started to wonder if silence was going to be the entire answer. You want me to reinforce a foreign village paper toys, Kurama said finally. For a woman who spent years feeding an organization built specifically to hunt things like me, so that a handful of humans who have never done anything for me in my entire miserable existence can sleep slightly better at night. Give me one reason I should consider that a good use of my time. Because it's the right thing to do, Naruto said, which was true, and which he realized was a mistake the instant it left his mouth. Kurama's laugh this time had no warmth in it at all. The right thing to do. The words came back distorted, mocking, stretched out like something being examined for flaws. Do you have any idea how many humans have stood exactly where you're standing and told me some version of that sentence, right before asking me to bleed for their cause? I've heard every variation there is. It has never once been true in the way you mean it, and it is not going to start being true today simply because you believe it when you say it. Okay, then how about this? Something hardened in Naruto's chest that had nothing to do with strategy. She's an orphan who watched everyone she ever loved die for a cause that ate them alive, and she's still trying to build something better out of the wreckage instead of giving up or burning it all down for revenge. I know a little something about growing up with nobody, Kurama. I don't get to just walk past somebody doing that when I actually can help. Sentiment. Though something in the dismissal came a fraction slower than the one before it, still not a reason that concerns me. Yeah, figured, Naruto exhaled. Then forget right and wrong. Forget her too for a second. Here's the part that's actually about me. If I go up against Akatsuki again without something that actually works, and I lose, you don't get freedom. You get a new cage, built by whoever wins, however they decide to build it. Maybe somebody who actually deserves you hating them for once. So yeah, this helps Rain. It also means I don't die stupid, which means you don't spend the next few decades getting passed around like an inheritance nobody asked for. A low sound moved through the water at his feet, something between a laugh and a growl. Self-interest. Finally, an argument I don't have to pretend to respect. 2 vast red eyes narrowed, studying him the way something ancient studies something it has already outlived several versions of. Understand what you are actually asking, whelp. Every jailer before you drew what they needed and gave nothing back, not respect, not choice, not even the courtesy of asking first. You are asking me to hand something over willingly. That is not a small request, coming from something that has spent longer sealed in gutters than your entire species has existed as a concept. Naruto didn't have a clever answer for that, so he didn't try to invent one. Then don't do it for free. Name a price. Kurama considered that for a long moment, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, not warmer exactly, but more precise. The particular shift that happens once both sides admit they're actually negotiating instead of posturing. 2 conditions. First, you will use my name when you address me, not whatever half-remembered insult your generation of jailers has settled on this week. I have had exactly one host who ever bothered. It was a long time ago. You wouldn't know her. Something moved behind the enormous eyes that might, on a being capable of it, have been closer to memory than anger. I find I have not entirely stopped noticing the absence since. Okay, Naruto said, quiet enough that it didn't feel like it needed to be louder. Kurama. Something flickered behind the bars, surprise, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but not quite fast enough. Was that so difficult? A little, yeah. You're kind of terrifying. Good! For just a moment, it almost sounded like Kurama meant that as a compliment. Second condition. This is not unconditional, and it is not permanent. I am lending you something, not gifting it to you. That fool of a father of yours bent the seal just far enough during your little tantrum with pain that this doesn't kill either of us outright. Be grateful to him for that, not to me. but the moment you use what I give you recklessly, or the moment I decide the cost to me outweighs whatever you think you're accomplishing, I stop. No warning, no negotiation in the moment. You will not enjoy finding out what happens to paper mid-reinforcement when I simply stop paying attention to it. Deal, Naruto said, and meant it the same uncomplicated way he meant most things. Then listen, because I will only explain this once. My chakra is not like yours. It does not have the courtesy to sit quietly and be shaped by clumsy human technique. Draw it raw, the way you draw your own, and it will scorch anything not built to hold something like me, your friend's precious paper included. Dilute it carelessly to make it safer, and it will fight whatever's containing it, because that is what I have spent centuries doing to every container I have ever been poured into. If this is going to work without destroying the very thing you're trying to protect, I have to give it to you shaped. Tempered, which means you cannot simply take it, you have to let me participate, every single time, or this ends in wreckage and probably in somebody's paper melting through their hand. Got it? Naruto said, already fairly sure that understanding the instructions and successfully following them were going to turn out to be two very different problems. He was right. The mission desk noticed the request this time, if only barely. An extended solo training leave, 4 days instead of the usual 1 or 2, approved with a raised eyebrow from Shizune that Naruto chose to interpret as curiosity rather than suspicion. He told himself the excuse still held. He was less sure of that than he had been a week ago, and made a note, somewhere underneath everything else he was trying to manage, not to think too hard about how many more times this particular lie could stretch before it simply ran out of room. He passed Shikamaru in the hallway on his way out, and wasn't quick enough with an answer when Shikamaru asked. In the particular lazy tone, that meant he was actually paying very close attention. Where exactly 4 days of solo training was supposed to take him that the usual grounds couldn't already cover. Around, Naruto said, which was not an answer, and which Shikamaru clearly noted as not being one, filing it away behind an expression that gave nothing back. Neither of them said anything else about it. Naruto spent the first hour of the walk to Rain Country trying to convince himself that meant it was fine. By the time the real him crossed back into Aimgakure's outer perimeter, on foot this time, not through a clone's borrowed memory, Konan already had a fresh stock of paper waiting in the war room. Isamu, stationed in the doorway out of what Naruto suspected was now habit more than suspicion, and an expression on Konan's face that suggested she'd used the intervening days to brace herself for exactly how badly this could still go wrong. Slowly, she said again, an echo of 3 days ago that neither of them commented on. Same as before, tell me if something feels wrong. Naruto drew a thread of chakra up from the seal and felt it arrive reluctant, thick, and hot in a way his own chakra never was. He pushed it toward the sheet she held steady between them. The paper began to smoke before he'd even finished the motion. Konan dropped it before either of them had to find out what happened next, stamping out a curl of char along one edge with the flat of her palm before it could spread. The rest of the sheet was technically intact, in the sense that a badly sunburned person is technically still a person. Blackened along both edges, brittle in a way that had nothing to do with dryness, crumbling faintly when she picked it back up to examine it. That's not destabilizing, she said. That's just fire with extra steps. Yeah, I noticed. Naruto flexed his hand, half expecting to see his own skin reddened, though of course it wasn't. The burn had happened 3 feet away, to something that wasn't him, which somehow didn't make it feel any less like his fault. Isamu, watching from the doorway, didn't say paper tricks this time. He didn't need to. His expression did it for him. The second attempt used less. A trickle instead of a push, filtered through enough of his own chakra first that it arrived at the paper diluted, more suggestion than substance. It didn't scorch anything, it also didn't stay still. The reinforced section began to ripple, first at the edges and then all the way through. An uneven, twitching motion like something breathing that hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to. Conan's expression went carefully blank in the specific way Naruto had learned meant she was working very hard not to react to something frightening. "It doesn't want to be here," she said quietly, holding the sheet at arm's length. "I can feel it. Not hostile exactly, just unwilling. Like something being dragged instead of asked." Naruto let the chakra dissipate immediately, and the rippling stopped the second he did. Somewhere behind the seal, Kurama made a sound that was almost infuriatingly smug. "I did tell you. You could have told me a little more specifically." Naruto muttered, out loud, which earned him a look from Konan that suggested she'd stopped being surprised by him talking to apparently nobody sometime around the third day of knowing him. "He says diluting it isn't the answer," Naruto explained. "Says it needs to be given properly, not just leaked around the edges of something else." "Then let's try giving it properly," Konan said, unfolding a fresh sheet without a trace of hesitation that Naruto suspected had cost her something to produce. "Wait." She held up a hand before he could start. "If forcing it creates resistance on his end, the same is probably true on mine. I've been holding this ready the way I'd hold it against an attack, braced, not open." She exhaled once, deliberately, something shifting in her posture that Naruto couldn't entirely name but could feel like a held breath finally let go. "Try again. Now." He tried something different this time, not drawing the chakra out and pushing it forward, but doing something closer to asking. Holding the intention the way he'd hold a door open for someone, an invitation instead of a demand. "Give it to her the way you'd give it if you actually meant it," he thought, toward the bars, toward the vast red shape coiled behind them. "Not because I'm taking it, because you're choosing to." For a long moment, nothing happened, and Naruto had just enough time to wonder if he'd imagined the whole idea being possible in the first place. Then the chakra came through different. Not weaker, if anything, more of it. A warm, heavy pressure that filled the space between his hands and the paper like something settling into a shape it had chosen for itself, instead of being forced into. Conan's paper took it the way dry ground takes rain after a long drought. Evenly, completely, without a single curl of smoke or a single uneven ripple. When she lifted the sheet this time, it held its shape under her fingers, flexible and faintly warm to the touch, its edges glowing with a color that hadn't existed in the room a moment ago. Not the pale gold of Naruto's chakra, not the stark white of her paper, but something in between, a deep, banked red that looked, in the low light of the war room, almost like the color of something burning slowly instead of fast. Isamu waved over to put it through its paces, hit it with a kunai hard enough to crack stone. The paper held. Konan folded it hard, along a crease that should have split it the same way the wind-reinforced attempt had weeks earlier. It bent and held and unfolded back into shape, as if it had never been stressed at all. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything, because there wasn't an obvious joke or complaint left to make. "It needs a name," Konan said eventually, turning the reinforced sheet over in her hands, watching the banked red catch the light. "If this is going to be the thing this village survives on, it needs to be more than the paper that eventually worked." "Vermilion?" Naruto offered, nodding at the color. "That's the actual name for that, right? Not just red. "It is." Konan considered it, then considered him, something almost like amusement in the look. "And what would you call the rest of it?" The part where a fox with several centuries of good reasons to hate humanity just agreed to help build a wall instead of tearing one down. Naruto thought about the negotiation. About Kurama actually choosing, for once, instead of having something taken from him. About Konan asking her own paper to accept instead of forcing it to comply. About an entire village built, improbably, on the idea that people, and apparently on a good day, foxes, could choose each other deliberately instead of being conscripted into it. "An accord," he said. "Nobody's making anybody do anything. Everybody just agreed." Konan looked at the sheet in her hands for a long moment. "The Vermilion Accord," she said, testing the shape of the words out loud, the way she tested most things before deciding whether to trust them. "It'll do." The 2 days after that blurred into something Naruto would later have trouble separating into distinct memories. Hours spent cross-legged in the war room while Kurama walked him through the same handoff over and over, until it stopped feeling like a negotiation and started feeling, almost, like a rhythm. Small failures still happened. A scorched corner here, a section that rippled there when his concentration slipped at the wrong moment. But each one took less time to fix than the one before it. And by the second evening, Konan could hand him a blank sheet without either of them flinching in anticipation of what might go wrong. They tested it properly 2 days later, on the section of the eastern wall that had taken the worst damage during the invasion and never been fully repaired. The same stretch. Isamu pointed out without much ceremony that a half-decent fire jutsu would have gone straight through even before the invasion, back when the wall was supposedly at its best. Word of the test had traveled further than Konan probably intended. By the time they reached the wall, a small, cautious crowd had gathered at a safe distance. A few off-duty genin, a handful of vendors from the market district, and Ren, standing at the front of it with Sora's hand in his, both of them watching with the specific intensity of children who had learned not to hope for things until after they'd already happened. "Control test first," Konan said. "The old wall. I want to see exactly what we're comparing this to." Isamu didn't need to be asked twice. Fire release wasn't flashy in his hands, just efficient. One of the few genuinely useful things left over from a war that had taken almost everything else from him. It was a strange thing, he'd admitted to Konan the night before, being asked to attack his own village's wall on purpose, even for a good reason. He'd spent enough years defending against exactly this kind of jutsu that some old, stubborn part of him resisted pointing it at Aimgakure's own stone. Reason or no reason. He did it anyway, the way he'd done most difficult things in his life, because someone needed to, and he happened to be standing there. He put a solid stream of flame into an unreinforced section of old stone and timber 20 meters down the wall. It didn't so much breach as simply stop existing. Where a solid section of wall had stood a moment before, there was now a smoking, collapsed gap wide enough to march 2 men through side by side. That's what you would have been trying to defend against a month ago, Konan said, to no one in particular, though everyone standing there understood exactly who the comment was for. Now the real test. She'd spent the better part of the last 2 days weaving vermilion-reinforced paper directly into the wall's newest repair section. Layered under stone, threaded between support beams. An invisible skeleton nobody looking at the wall from the outside would ever guess was there. Naruto stood beside it, one hand flat against the stone, feeding it a slow, steady current of tempered chakra the way he and Kurama had spent 2 days learning to do without setting anything on fire by accident. Isamu didn't hold back the second time either. If anything, the flame that left his hands was hotter, angrier, thrown with the particular effort of a man who wanted an honest answer and intended to make sure he got one. It hit the reinforced section and simply stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed in any way that looked dramatic. The fire spent itself against stone that refused to stop being stone, scorching the surface a deep, ugly black and doing absolutely nothing else. When the flame died, the wall was still standing, warm to the touch and marked with soot and completely, structurally intact. For a long moment, nobody said anything. "Huh," Isamu said finally, which from him was practically a speech. Behind them, somewhere in the small crowd, someone actually cheered, one voice, quickly joined by a few more, self-conscious and disbelieving, like people trying out a sound they hadn't used in a while and weren't entirely sure they still remembered how to make properly. Naruto exhaled like he'd been holding his breath through the entire exchange, which, in a way, he had. 2 days of learning to hold this particular door open without slamming it, and it still took everything he had to keep the current steady through even one test. One wall, one section, one controlled demonstration on a calm afternoon. He did the math without wanting to and didn't love the answer. An entire perimeter, held like this, under real siege conditions, was a very different question than one reinforced section standing up to one fire jutsu with nothing else trying to kill anybody at the same time. He decided not to say that part out loud. Not yet. Everyone standing there had earned exactly one good afternoon before the next problem showed up, and he wasn't in any hurry to be the one who ended it early. Konan came to stand beside him at some point during the noise, close enough that he almost missed what she said under the sound of a village cautiously remembering how to be glad about something. "Thank you," she said, not effusive. "Not more than the moment needed, just that. Don't thank me yet." Naruto said, "We've still got to find out if it holds up against something that's actually trying to kill somebody." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm still allowed to be glad about today, though." "Yeah," Naruto agreed, and found, a little to his own surprise, that he was too. "Yeah, you are." Behind them, the rain kept falling against a wall that, for the first time in longer than anyone standing there could easily remember, actually held. Shikamaru Nara did not go looking for the pattern. It found him, the way most patterns did, by refusing to stop being inconvenient until somebody noticed it. It started as an idle observation over shogi with Choji. Naruto had turned down 3 consecutive invitations to spar, which was itself notable, since Naruto had never in recorded history turned down an opportunity to get hit in the face by someone he considered a rival. It became slightly less idle when Shikamaru, covering a rotation at the mission desk because someone had to and he'd drawn the short straw, noticed the same genin's name attached to 4 separate solo training requests in 3 weeks, each one longer than the last. None of them naming a training ground any instructor had actually signed off on. It stopped being idle entirely when he mentioned it to Sakura, mostly as conversation, and watched her expression shift into the specific stillness of someone recalculating a diagnosis. "He's not sleeping enough for someone who says he's just training," she said. "And whatever he's doing out there, it isn't building muscle. I checked his chakra signature during a checkup 2 weeks ago, and it read like he'd run a marathon on fumes. That's not what 4 days of tree-climbing exercises does to a person." Shikamaru had learned a long time ago that most problems solved themselves if he waited long enough and stayed out of the way. This did not feel like most problems. He spent an evening he would rather have spent watching clouds cross-referencing Naruto's absences against the handful of intelligence reports that had crossed his desk in the last month. Border chatter out of Rain Country, unconfirmed and mostly dismissed as noise at the time. A foreign chakra signature, bright and unregistered, detected at the edge of sensor range near Aimgakure. Logged and shelved because nobody on duty that week could explain it, and explaining the unexplainable wasn't technically anyone's job. It matched. Not perfectly, nothing in intelligence work ever matched perfectly, but well enough that the shape of it made an uncomfortable kind of sense once he stopped trying to make it be about anything smaller than what it obviously was. "Troublesome," he said to an empty room which was as close as Shikamaru ever came to sounding alarmed. He found Naruto at the training ground the next morning, alone, running through a Rasengan drill with the distracted intensity of someone whose body was present and whose mind clearly wasn't. "We need to talk," Shikamaru said, "about the part of your training regimen that happens in Aimgakure." Naruto's hand missed the shape of the jutsu entirely, chakra dispersing in a harmless little pop instead of forming, which told Shikamaru everything the conversation hadn't gotten around to yet. "I don't know what you're talking about," Naruto said, with the specific speed of someone who absolutely did. 4 training requests in 3 weeks, each one longer than the last. No training ground listed that any senseis ever confirmed. A chakra signature at Rain's border that matches yours closely enough I'd bet my whole salary on it, if I had one worth betting. Sakura says you're chakra exhausted in a way tree walking doesn't explain. Shikamaru counted the points off on his fingers, unhurried, the way he laid out a losing position on a shogi board for an opponent who hadn't noticed they'd already lost. "I'm not here to turn you in, Naruto. I'm here because I did that math in one evening with nothing better to do, and if I did it, somebody whose actual job is finding things like this is going to do it a lot faster and a lot less kindly. For a long moment, Naruto didn't say anything, and Shikamaru watched him decide, almost visibly, that the lie had finally run out of room to stand in. So he told him. All of it, Nagato, the promise, Konan's offer, the clones, the failed attempts, Kurama, the wall that had held against fire that should have gone straight through it. Shikamaru listened without interrupting, the way he listened to everything, cataloging it into a shape he could actually use instead of reacting to each piece as it arrived. When Naruto finished, Shikamaru exhaled something that wasn't quite a sigh. You do realize what this looks like on paper. A leaf shinobi, unauthorized, using tailed beast chakra inside a foreign village that was actively at war with us a month ago. I know what it looks like. Do you? Because what it looks like, if the wrong person finds it before you explain it yourself, is treason, not reckless. Not well-intentioned, treason with a jinchuriki attached to it, which is exactly the kind of headline that starts wars instead of ending them. Shikamaru rubbed the back of his neck, the closest he ever came to visible frustration. You need to tell Tsunade-sama today, before I have to, or before somebody with a lot less patience than me finds it on their own and decides how the story gets told without you in the room. And if she has me locked up the second I finish talking, then at least it'll be because you told her the truth and not because somebody caught you in a lie. Shikamaru shrugged, the gesture doing a lot of work for someone who found most things too troublesome to bother emphasizing. That matters more than you'd think with her. It's the difference between a problem she has to punish and a problem she gets to solve. Don't waste it. He turned to go, then stopped, because leaving it purely tactical felt like leaving something important unsaid. For what it's worth, I get why you did it. Doesn't mean it wasn't reckless as hell, just means I get it. A pause, the closest Shikamaru ever came to visibly caring about something out loud. Try not to die keeping a promise to a dead guy. Some of us would actually miss you. Wow, almost sounded like you meant that. Don't get used to it. Shikamaru said, already walking away, hands in his pockets, radiating the specific relief of a man who had said the sincere part out loud and could now go back to pretending he hadn't. He'd rehearsed the conversation 4 different ways on the walkover, and abandoned all 4 of them somewhere around the second flight of stairs, because every version made it sound like he was asking permission for something he'd already spent weeks deciding he didn't need. This wasn't going to be that. He wasn't here to ask if he could keep doing it. He was here because Shikamaru was right, and because some quiet part of him had been waiting for an excuse to stop carrying this alone since the night Konan's first paper clone had found him standing in an empty training ground. Tsunade was reviewing supply requisitions when Naruto knocked, which was, in retrospect, the last entirely calm moment either of them would have for the next hour. I need to tell you something, Naruto said, before he could lose his nerve the way he'd been losing it in increments all the way up the stairs. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if you stop me halfway, I don't think I'll get through the rest of it. Something in his tone made Tsunade set down the requisition forms entirely. He told her everything, start to finish, the way he'd told Shikamaru an hour earlier, but slower this time, more careful, because this version of the story had consequences attached to every sentence. Nagato's death. The promise. Konan's clone in the training ground. The shadow clones, the aqueduct, Isamu, the 2 orphans who'd started calling a warehouse floor home. The wind that shredded paper. The failed experiments. Kurama, his name, spoken out loud in this office for what Naruto was fairly sure was the first time in years, and the negotiation that came with actually asking instead of just drawing on him mid-emergency. The wall. The fire jutsu that hadn't gone through it. Tsunade didn't say a word until he finished, which took considerably longer than either of them expected, and which cost her, visibly, more restraint than Naruto had ever seen her spend on anything that didn't involve a hospital bed. When he finally stopped talking, the silence went on long enough that he started to wonder if she was going to answer him with a fist instead of words. You used the Nine-Tails chakra. Her voice was very quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. Voluntarily, repeatedly, in another village. Without a medical team on standby, without so much as informing your own Hawkage that you were doing it, while I was unconscious in a hospital bed, recovering from keeping this village from falling down around your ears. The quiet cracked on the last word, temper finally catching up to the sentence. Do you have any idea what happens if that arrangement fails even once? If Kurama decides the cost outweighs whatever he's getting out of it, mid-technique, in a village with children in it? Do you understand what I would be cleaning up, Naruto? Not politically. Actually, bodies. I know. Naruto said, and didn't flinch away from it, because flinching would have meant he thought she was wrong to be furious, and he didn't. I thought about that every single time. I still decided it was worth the risk, because the alternative was watching a village full of people who already lost everything once finished dying quietly where nobody was looking. I'm not sorry I did it. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Those aren't the same thing. And I'm not going to pretend they are just to make this conversation easier on either of us. Tsunade stared at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but sharpening into something Naruto recognized from every serious mission briefing he'd ever sat through. The anger didn't leave. It just stopped being the only thing in the room. She was quiet for a moment longer, and when she spoke again, some of the Hawkage had receded, leaving just a woman remembering things she didn't often let herself remember out loud. Jiraiya spent half his life trying to build peace out of exactly the kind of wreckage Rain is right now, and he died before he ever found out whether any of it actually worked. Nagato was supposed to be his failure, his one unfixable mistake. She looked at Naruto for a long moment. You just told me his failure spent his last breath asking you to prove it wasn't permanent, and you're the reason it might not be. I don't know what to do with that. I don't think grief and strategy are supposed to agree with each other this cleanly, and it's making it very hard to stay as angry at you as I'd like to. Sit down, she said, before he could answer that. And tell me again, slower, exactly how defensible that wall actually is. Because like it or not, brat, you didn't just risk your own neck. You handed me a fact on the ground that I now have to decide what to do with, and I would very much like to make that decision with information instead of adrenaline. She was quiet for a while after he finished the second, more careful version, pacing in front of the window the way she did when a decision needed weighing instead of feeling. Here's my problem, she said finally, not quite to him, more like she was arguing with the part of herself that still wanted to be furious. A collapsed Aimgakure is a vacuum. It was already sniffing at the border, by your own account. And if it isn't Iwa, it's whatever's left of Akatsuki deciding an ungoverned, defenseless village next door to a dead god's old base is worth picking over. Either outcome puts something hostile 2 days from our own border, permanently, with no goodwill toward us at all. She stopped pacing. A stable Rain, armed, however strangely and grateful to the shinobi who helped keep it that way, is worth considerably more to this village than my pride over not being told sooner. I don't like how you got here. I am not going to pretend I do. But I am the Hawkage, not just your Bachan, and the Hawkage doesn't get to throw away a useful outcome because she's annoyed about the process that produced it. Danzo arrived within the hour, Hamura and Koharu trailing a step behind him, which told Naruto, more than anything Tsunade had said, exactly how fast this had stopped being a conversation between two people. Danzo listened to the summary, Tsunade's version, clipped and strategic, stripped of anything she considered none of his business, without a single visible reaction, the way Naruto imagined a man might listen to a weather report before deciding whether it affected his plans. This is, without question, an opportunity, Danzo said once she'd finished. Rain is disarmed, leaderless in any formal sense, and entirely dependent on the goodwill of a Konoha shinobi for its continued survival. We would be fools to treat that as a liability to be managed rather than an asset to be secured. Formalize the arrangement. Station a contingent. Integrate what remains of their shinobi corps under proper oversight, and Aimgakure becomes a buffer state instead of a permanent question mark on our border. You mean occupy it, Naruto said, before he could stop himself, and call it a favor. Danzo's single visible eye moved to him with the mild, unhurried interest of a man observing a variable he hadn't previously bothered to account for. I mean survive, boy, which requires considerably less sentiment than whatever you've been running on for the last month. But if the word troubles you, yes. Occupation, in function if not in name, names have never changed what a thing actually is. Hamura cleared his throat before Danzo could continue. Whatever the merits of the boys' initiative, Hokage-sama, we cannot ignore that a Jinchuriki has been operating unsupervised in a foreign nation for weeks. At minimum, this requires structure. Danzo's instinct toward formalization is not, on its face, unreasonable. Koharu, silent until then, tilted her head slightly. Or, she said, we could recognize that the boy has already accomplished, by accident, what a decade of careful diplomacy never managed, genuine goodwill in Rain country instead of fear. It seems remarkably short-sighted to smother that the moment it becomes inconvenient to explain in a council meeting. Formalization and occupation aren't the same word no matter how carefully you both keep almost saying it, Tsunade said, without looking away from Danzo. I heard the reasonable version. I'm about to explain why I'm not taking it. And if I refuse to authorize that, she went on, which, for the record, I am refusing to authorize, what's your alternative? Then end it. Danzo's tone didn't shift at all. Recall the boy. Sever all contact, publicly and completely, and disavow any connection to whatever Aimgakure does or does not survive without him. We cannot afford the appearance of meddling in a sovereign village's internal affairs unless we intend to control the outcome. Half measures are how villages stumble into wars they never meant to fight. Those aren't my only two options. They are the only two rational ones. Then I suppose I'm about to be irrational. Tsunade planted both hands on her desk, and Naruto recognized, with something like relief, the specific posture she took right before she stopped asking anyone in the room for permission. The entire point of what this idiot stumbled into is that Aimgakure isn't being controlled by anyone anymore. Not Hanzo, not Akatsuki, not whatever the 5 nations decide it should be next. The instant we formalize control over it, in function or in name, we've replaced one flag with another, and I promise you every nation watching will read it exactly that way, including the ones we'd like to stay at peace with. That ends whatever goodwill Naruto actually earned, and it makes a liar out of the one thing that's kept Rain from becoming a battlefield again. She turned to Danzo directly. And I'm not ordering him to abandon it either, because unlike you, I don't throw away a strategic advantage the instant it becomes politically inconvenient to explain. Aimgakure stays independent. Naruto's involvement continues quietly, without any official sanction another nation could point to and call provocation. A beat. You'll have oversight on the intelligence side, Danzo, because unfortunately your instincts for finding threats before they mature are better than anyone else's in this room. I want to know the second Iwa, or anyone else, so much as breathes wrong in Rain's direction. That is the extent of your involvement. Am I understood? Something in Danzo's expression didn't quite move, which was, Naruto was beginning to understand, exactly how the man expressed disagreement he had no intention of voicing out loud. Perfectly, Hokage-sama, it did not sound like agreement. It sounded like a man filing away a decision he intended to work around. Tsunade dismissed Naruto not long after, with a warning about mission logs and chain of command that he suspected was going to involve considerably more paperwork than he was prepared for, and a last, quieter word that had nothing to do with policy at all. For what it's worth. She said at the door, I'm still angry with you. I'm also glad you told me instead of letting me find out from someone else's report. Don't make me choose between those two feelings again. I won't, Naruto said, and meant it, and had absolutely no way of knowing yet how little that promise was about to be worth. That evening, he sent a clone east with the news before he let himself think too hard about how to phrase it. Konan took it the way she took most difficult information, without visible reaction, though the pause before she spoke told the clone she was recalculating several things at once. "Your Hawkage knows," she said, "and didn't end it." "She didn't end it. She's not thrilled about it either." The clone hesitated. "There's a man on her council who wanted to turn Rain into a leaf protectorate, and when that got shot down, wanted to just cut you loose instead. She said no to both. His name's Danzo. I don't trust him. Neither does she, not all the way. She gave him one narrow job and told him not to touch anything else." "I've heard the name." Something in Conan's voice went carefully neutral in the way that usually meant she was more concerned than she intended to show. Rain's old intelligence network flagged him years ago, back when Hanzo still ruled here. A man who collects power quietly is more dangerous than one who doesn't bother hiding his ambitions. "Yeah." The clone didn't have anything reassuring to offer, so it didn't try to invent something. "Just watch your back a little closer than usual for a while. That's all I've got." "I generally do," Conan said, "but I appreciate the warning regardless." Danzo did not go home after the council session ended. He went, instead, to a room that appeared on no official floor plan of the Hawkage Tower, where a handful of blank, unremarkable faces waited for him with the patience of people who had been trained out of needing anything better to do. The room smelled faintly of damp stone and older secrets, lit by a single lantern that left most of the space, and most of the people standing in it, comfortably unaccounted for. "Hawkage-sama has granted me oversight of Aimgakure's security situation," he said to the room in general, in the same flat tone he'd used to agree to Tsunede's terms an hour earlier. "Oversight requires information. Information requires eyes on the ground, not the boy's clumsy shadow clones playing at diplomacy, but something capable of actually understanding what is being built there." A pause, deliberate, the way all of Danzo's pauses were deliberate. "I want to know precisely how the Uzumaki boy is binding the Ninetails chakra to that woman's technique. Not the outcome, the mechanism. If something in that arrangement can be replicated or extracted or improved upon without the sentimental inefficiencies its current custodians insist on attaching to it. I want to know that too, before anyone else has the chance to reach the same conclusion." One of the masked figures inclined their head fractionally and was gone, absorbed back into the dark of the tunnel without a sound. Danzo remained a moment longer, alone, considering the map of the 5 nations pinned to the wall. Rain Country, a small, damp smear near its edge, newly interesting in a way it had not been in years. Tsunade had asked to be told the instant something threatened Aimgakure's border. Danzo intended to keep his word about that. He simply had no intention of mentioning that some threats, in his professional experience, were best generated in-house, where they could be controlled from the very beginning. It had been, by every measure that mattered, a good week. The wall held. The aqueduct kept running. 2 more districts had generators again, cobbled together from salvaged parts, and the specific stubbornness Conan had come to recognize as the village's actual native resource. Sora had started following Conan on her morning rounds, 3 steps behind and silent, but there, which counted as progress by any measure that actually mattered in Aimgakure these days. Naruto had spent that particular evening doing something closer to maintenance than heroics, walking the reinforced stretch of wall with one hand trailing along the stone, feeding it a slow trickle of tempered chakra just to confirm the accord held its charge overnight the way Kurama had promised it would, while Conan cross-referenced supply counts by lantern light in the guard post nearby. It was, by the standards either of them had gotten used to, almost boring. Ren had taken to shadowing the border patrols during daylight hours lately, close enough to watch, far enough to stay out from underfoot. Isamu's quiet compromise with a boy who'd made it clear he intended to learn everything eventually, whether anyone approved or not. Sora still didn't talk much, but she'd started humming while she folded paper scraps into shapes Konan hadn't taught her. Small, stubborn melodies that belonged to some life before all of this that nobody had ever bothered asking her about. It was the kind of evening that made the last 2 months feel almost like they might, eventually, add up to something other than survival. They came at the changing of the watch, the way anyone competent would, the 10-minute window when the outgoing patrol's attention had already started drifting towards sleep, and the incoming patrol hadn't yet fully shaken off the walk from the barracks. 3 of them, moving through the tree line east of the wall with the specific, economical silence of people who had been trained out of wasting a single unnecessary motion. They didn't move like bandits. Bandits wanted things, food, valuables, an easy village to bully. These 3 wanted information, and they moved like it, bypassing the obvious entry points, pausing at the reinforced section of wall long enough to press a gloved palm flat against the stone and hold it there, measuring something the naked eye couldn't see. Isamu felt it before he saw it, the specific wrongness of chakra moving where chakra wasn't supposed to be, precise and quiet in a way that told him immediately whoever this was had done this before, professionally, more than once. He didn't shout a warning. Shouting was for amateurs and people who wanted to lose the element of surprise along with everything else. He signaled the 2 genin nearest him, drew a kunai, and went to find out exactly how much of a mistake these 3 had just made. The fight, when it started, told Naruto everything he needed to know before a single word was exchanged. He blocked a kick aimed at his ribs with the specific, unthinking reflex of someone who had drilled the exact same defense 1,000 times against a very particular kind of taijutsu style, and felt something cold settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with the impact. "This is leaf form," he said mostly to himself in the half-second before the masked figure came at him again. These guys trained in Konoha?" The operative didn't answer, didn't so much as break stride, pressing the exchange with a discipline that felt less like aggression and more like an exam being administered. A strike here to test reaction speed, a feint there to see whether the response was instinct or memorized pattern. Naruto caught the 3rd strike on his forearm hard enough to bruise, and answered with a Rasengan that never fully formed, because his opponent was already gone. Backstepping out of range with the exact margin of safety a textbook would recommend, and not a fraction more. They're not trying to win, Naruto realized, chasing the thought through the next exchange of blows. They're trying to log me. Konan didn't have time to answer him even if she'd heard the thought out loud, locked in a duel of her own against the 2nd operative. Paper meeting kunai in a blur too fast to follow. Every strike from her opponent aimed with the patient precision of someone who wasn't trying to kill her so much as map exactly how her jutsu responded to different angles of attack. He circled her the way a man circles a machine he's trying to understand rather than a person he's trying to hurt. And twice, she caught him deliberately provoking a reaction just to see which of her constructs answered fastest. She let him think it was working for exactly as long as it took to identify the rhythm of his testing, then broke it. 100 blades of paper fanning out from both hands at once, not toward him but around him. A cage closing from every angle he hadn't accounted for because he'd spent too long assuming the fight was still a controlled experiment. He was fast. He was not fast enough to be in 6 places he needed to defend at the same time. The 3rd had gone for the wall itself, running through hand seals fast enough that Isamu barely had time to recognize the shape of the jutsu building before it hit. A concentrated blast of wind nature chakra, focused and vicious, aimed squarely at the same reinforced section they'd tested against fire 2 weeks earlier. "Wind," Naruto said, something between a laugh and a curse. "Of course it's wind," it held. Not effortlessly, the impact staggered the stone, sent a spiderweb of hairline cracks skating across the surface. But it held, and the operative's reaction, a fractional stillness that read as surprise on a face trained not to have one, told Naruto everything he needed to know about what the attack had actually been for. not destruction. Data. Somebody had known exactly what used to break this wall and sent someone to check whether it still did. The realization sat wrong in Naruto's chest, worse somehow than if they'd simply been trying to kill him. Whoever sent these three didn't care whether Rain survived or burned. They just wanted to know how the fire worked. Isamu closed the distance on the wall tester before the man could reset his stance. Taking the opening the way he'd learned to take every opening in 30 years of a career built on outliving people more talented than he was. Not clean, not elegant, just fast enough and mean enough to matter. An elbow to the jaw staggered his opponent half a step, which was all the room Isamu needed to get an arm locked around his throat and bear him down into the mud. Konan ended her fight first. She wrapped the second operative in a cocoon of paper too dense and too fast to escape before he'd finished processing that his testing phase had turned into an actual fight, moving before he'd fully stopped struggling, paper snapping tight across his jaw and lower face in the same motion that bound his arms, sealing his mouth shut before his tongue could find whatever was hidden behind his teeth. Root operatives carry a failsafe, she said, in answer to the question Naruto hadn't finished asking. A seal, usually in the mouth, bite down with intent and it kills them before anyone can ask a single question. I've dealt with Akatsuki's own version of the same problem more than once. You learn to move fast, or you learn nothing at all. Isamu had the third pinned by then, one arm wrenched hard enough behind his back that continuing the fight wasn't an option his body was willing to consider anymore. Breathing hard but grinning in the specific, savage way of a man who'd needed a fight that actually meant something for longer than he'd admitted to anyone. Naruto's clone had already dropped the one it fought into unconsciousness with a blow precise enough that the man hadn't had time to reach for anything in his mouth at all. One captive would have to be enough. It was, as it turned out, exactly enough. It bothered Naruto more than he wanted to admit, standing there in the aftermath. Not the danger. He'd stopped flinching from danger a long time ago, but the specific wrongness of trading blows with people who moved like Uruka-sensei had once taught him to move, like Kakashi. Like half the instructors who'd shaped who he was. Whoever these three answered to had built them out of the same clay as everyone Naruto trusted, and then filed off whatever part of that clay was supposed to make them recognizable as people first and weapons second. Isamu stood over the two unconscious operatives for a long moment, breathing hard, the adrenaline draining out of him slower than it used to when he was younger. "Leaf trained," he said, to nobody in particular, turning the thought over like something with a bad taste. "You said it yourself. So which is it, did your village send them, or did somebody inside it send them without asking?" "The second," Naruto said, with more certainty than he felt entitled to yet. "Has to be. Tsunade wouldn't—" He stopped, because he didn't actually know that with the confidence he wanted to have, and pretending otherwise in front of a man who'd spent a career learning not to trust promises from people who looked like him felt like exactly the wrong way to start rebuilding what little ground they'd gained. "Find out," Isamu said, "before you decide which version of that sentence you actually believe." The operative didn't speak for the first hour, which didn't surprise Konan in the slightest. They'd moved him to a windowless storeroom 2 levels beneath what used to be her war room, lit by a single lantern and stripped of anything he might have used against himself or anyone else. Not cruelty. Just the same practicality that had kept this village alive on rationing and stubbornness for 2 months running. Root conditioning wasn't built to survive threats or pain. It was built to survive exactly this, patient silence from people with time to spend. She'd broken harder silences than his, working for an organization considerably less patient than Konoha's Hokage was likely to be about the timeline. "You're not going to die today," she said eventually, when the silence had run its useful course. "That was decided the moment I sealed your mouth instead of letting you use it. Whatever conditioning convinced you capture meant death has already been proven wrong. Everything after this point is just you deciding how long you'd like the conversation to take." Something in the set of his shoulders shifted, fractionally, the particular tell of a mind built for one specific outcome suddenly having to improvise around its absence. "You have nothing," he said finally, the first words he'd offered since the fight ended. "I don't have a name. I don't have an origin. I have a designation and a mission brief, and neither of those means anything outside the mission that issued them." "You're right that a designation doesn't mean anything," Konan agreed, "which is precisely why I'm not interested in your name. I'm interested in the shape of your orders, and orders have a shape whether or not the person carrying them out is willing to describe it. Who sent you? What you were told to look for? Who you report to when this is finished, assuming, from your perspective, that it ever was going to finish." She let that sit. "I've spent years listening to people who were absolutely certain silence would protect them. It never does. It only changes how long the conversation takes before it stops mattering. It took another hour, and a combination of patience, pointed questions, and Conan's own unnervingly precise read on which silences meant something and which didn't, before he finally gave them anything at all. Not a confession exactly, more a collection of details that added up to one whether he intended them to or not. A designation instead of a name. Orders received through a channel that led back to Konoha, though not, he was careful to specify, through any route that could be traced to the Hokage's office directly. A mission brief that used the word mechanism 3 separate times and the word aimgakure considerably less than that. And then, almost as an aside, delivered with the flat indifference of someone reporting a weather pattern rather than a threat. A second team, running reconnaissance along the same border 2 weeks earlier, had encountered something that wasn't shinobi at all. A presence that dissolved into the ground when approached. Chakra signatures matching no registered village, clustered thick enough around Rain's perimeter that his superiors had flagged it as a competing interest rather than a coincidence. Naruto felt the temperature of the room change without anyone touching anything. "Zetsu! I don't have a name for it," the operative said. "I have a pattern. Your enemies are already here, Uzumaki. Whatever you thought you were protecting this village from, you're about to learn it was never just one thing." Naruto sent the transcript to Konoha inside a clone's memory before the sun came up. And Shikamaru had it flagged, cross-referenced, and sitting on Tsunede's desk before she'd finished her first cup of tea. He'd read it twice by the time she called him in to confirm he wasn't imagining the parts that mattered. "It's not ambiguous," Shikamaru told her, setting the pieces out the way he set out anything, flat, unhurried, already 3 moves past where anyone else in the room had gotten to. "The wording's careful, but not careful enough. Mechanism isn't threat assessment language. Nobody assesses a threat by pressing a hand against it and holding still for 4 seconds. That's technique replication. That's Danzo doing what Danzo does, collecting something powerful because it exists and finding the justification for it afterward." Tsunade didn't look up from the transcript. "And the other thing is worse." Shikamaru's expression didn't change, which was somehow how Naruto had learned to recognize when something genuinely worried him. "If Root independently picked up Zetsu activity on that border without even looking for it, it's not a rumor anymore. It's confirmed, and it's been sitting there for at least 2 weeks while everyone was busy arguing about jurisdiction." Tsunade didn't raise her voice, which Naruto had learned by now was somehow worse than when she did. "You sent Root into a sovereign village, under my authority, to steal a technique, not to watch a border. I sent operatives to assess the security implications of an unprecedented chakra fusion technique operating in a politically unstable region," Danzo said, entirely unbothered. "That falls, by any reasonable reading, within the oversight you granted me yourself." "Don't." The word landed flat and final. "I've read the transcript. Mechanism, not threat assessment, not border security, mechanism. You didn't send them to watch Rain's border, Danzo. You sent them to steal my shinobi's technique out from under an ally. Using authority I gave you for something else entirely, and you nearly got 3 of your own people killed testing a defense you had no business testing in the first place. 3 trained operatives engaged, and only 1 lost. Danzo said it the way another man might report weather. By the standards of any intelligence operation I have ever run, that is a favorable outcome. It's a favorable outcome for you. It's an act of war if Aimgakure had chosen to treat it as one, and I would not have blamed them for making that choice. Tsunede's jaw tightened. You gambled with this village's only functioning alliance because you wanted a technique badly enough to risk it. And you did it without telling me, which means you already knew exactly how I'd answer if you asked. Something that might, on another man, have been the beginning of a concession moved through Danzo's expression and settled into nothing at all. The operation yielded results regardless of its framing. We now know Akatsuki remnants are active along that same border. Information Rain's own defenses failed to surface, obtained through my methods within a single reconnaissance cycle. I would suggest that outcome speaks for itself. It speaks to exactly one thing: that you'll excuse any method as long as it produces a result you can point to afterward. Tsunede's hands flattened against her desk. Your intelligence mandate over Aimgakure ends, now, effective immediately. Any further operation touching Rain country, route or otherwise, gets authorized through me directly in writing before a single operative sets foot past that border. If I find out you've circumvented that one more time, I won't be having this conversation with you again. I'll be having a very different one with the Council about whether route should exist in any form at all. As you say, Hokage-sama. Danzo inclined his head with exactly enough deference to avoid outright insubordination, and not one fraction more. Though I would note, for the record, that the threat my methods uncovered doesn't cease to exist simply because you've revoked my ability to investigate it. He was infuriatingly correct, and everyone in the room knew it. Back in Aimgakure, Konan stood at the same broken window she'd stood at the day the aqueduct came back online, looking out at a village that had just survived its first real test, only to learn the test had never been the point. Route was never the real problem, she said, when Naruto found her there. It was a distraction wearing a leaf headband. Whatever's actually circling this village hasn't shown its face yet. For what it's worth, Naruto said, Tsunade shut him down the second she saw the transcript, pulled his authority over Rain entirely. Isamu asked me straight out whether Konoha sent them or somebody inside it did without asking, and I told him the second one. I still believe that. I just wanted you to know I'm not going to pretend I'm completely sure, because you deserve better than me guessing out loud and calling it certainty. I appreciate the honesty more than you'd expect. Something in Conan's expression eased fractionally. For what it's worth, I don't think you're wrong. A woman who'd sanctioned this wouldn't have shut it down that fast, or that publicly, in front of people who could repeat it later. Abaito? Naruto said, and the name sat between them with all the weight it deserved. Abaito. Konan looked at the reinforced section of wall, still faintly scarred from the wind jutsu that had tested it 2 nights earlier. He's been patient for weeks. I don't think he stays patient much longer, now that he knows we're not the wounded village he could collect from at his leisure anymore. She was quiet for a moment. We built something that can survive a probe. We're about to find out if it can survive the thing that was always actually coming for it. Naruto didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't try to invent one. Instead, he thought about a promise made in a crater that felt like a different lifetime now. About a man who'd spent his last breath hoping someone would prove the world could hold together without him forcing it to. Nagato hadn't known about Abaito's in-game, not really, hadn't lived long enough to see how far the same darkness he'd once served would go without him standing in its way. That felt, suddenly, like its own kind of unfinished promise, not just building something. Defending it from the exact shape of ruin Nagato himself had once nearly become. We'll be ready, Naruto said, with more certainty than he had any right to feel yet. We have to be! Konan almost smiled, not quite, but close enough that Naruto counted it as a personal victory. Convenient, that ready is a decision and not a fact. I suppose we'll find out which one it actually is together. Somewhere beyond the wall, the rain kept falling on ground that had, until very recently, belonged to no one in particular, and would, one way or another, belong to someone by the time this was finished. Obito received the reports the way he received most things now, without surprise, and without much feeling attached to the absence of it. A fire technique, thrown at full strength against a section of Aimgakure's outer wall, had failed to breach it. A second test, wind-natured and considerably more vicious, had failed the same way 3 days later, leaving nothing behind but cracked stone and 3 root operatives who hadn't returned to wherever root operatives returned to. Both tests, his own quiet watchers along the border confirmed, had been aimed at the same reinforced stretch. The same stretch that, according to the pattern his intelligence had been assembling for weeks now, carried a chakra signature that didn't belong to Aimgakure, or to any paper technique on record, or to anything except a boy he'd been meaning to deal with for a very long time. It was, in its own irritating way, almost impressive. He considered the quiet options first, because he always did. Patience had served him longer and better than any weapon he had ever carried. Waiting for rain to collapse under its own weight, letting entropy finish what he could no longer end with a single unnoticed visit, that had been the plan for exactly as long as it remained viable. It stopped being viable the day a wall that should have folded to one competent fire jutsu simply didn't. Without Nagato's eyes, the ritual that would return Madara to a body capable of finishing what he'd started remained exactly what it had been for months. A plan half-built, waiting on a single component Obito could not manufacture and could not substitute. He had told himself for a while that there was no urgency in that waiting. Rain was dying. Dying things did not typically require intervention, they simply required time. He had believed that sincerely, right up until the moment it stopped being true, and a fortified, defiant, improbably functional Aimgakure became something he could no longer simply wait out. He had considered other approaches, briefly. A single, precise infiltration aimed only at Konan herself, bypassing the wall and the boy and all of it entirely. But the boy's shadow clones were everywhere now, thick enough on the ground that any strike quiet enough to avoid the reinforced defenses risked colliding with one of them instead. And clones had an inconvenient habit of reporting exactly what killed them the instant they dispersed. He had considered patience extended further still, letting the 5 nations do to Rain what the 5 nations inevitably did to unclaimed territory sitting on something valuable. But Iwa's scouts had already come and gone without committing to anything. Cautious in a way that suggested even they suspected the village was no longer the easy meal it used to be. Every quiet option had the same flaw. They all assumed more time than he currently had reason to believe he still possessed. You would find this funny, he thought, in the specific direction he sometimes still thought in, toward a version of Kakashi that no longer existed and a version of himself that had died with her. The boy who talked Nagato into peace is the same boy standing between me and the one thing I still need from him. There had been a time, long enough ago now, that he sometimes had to work to remember it clearly, when a plan like this had felt like mercy. A world folded gently into a single dream, where nobody's precious person had to die bleeding in his arms because he'd been 3 seconds too slow and 1 lifetime too naive. He still believed that, in whatever part of himself still bothered believing things. He simply no longer expected anyone else to understand it before the work was already finished, and he had stopped, a long time ago, needing them to. The thought didn't slow him down. It never did anymore. That was, depending on which version of himself was still capable of judging it, either the whole tragedy or the only mercy left in it. He gave the order the way he gave most orders, without theater, because theater was for people who still needed an audience to feel certain of themselves. Send them in slowly, he said, to the pale shape that had been waiting, patient and half-formed, at the edge of the clearing for exactly this instruction. I want to know precisely what that wall can survive before I ask it to survive something it can't. No large movements yet, just eyes. The white Zetsu inclined its head, already dissolving back into the ground before the gesture finished, and Obito was alone again with a map of Rain Country and a patience that had finally, after weeks of testing itself, begun to run out. Isamu felt the wrongness 3 nights later. On a patrol he'd walked so many times he could have done it with his eyes shut, which was, he reflected afterward, almost exactly what had nearly gotten him killed. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't even chakra, not in any way his training had ever taught him to detect it. More a wrongness in the shape of a shadow that shouldn't have had a shape at all. A patch of darkness at the base of a support tower that held its form a half-second longer than shadows were supposed to, when a lantern swung past it. The rain, for once, seemed to avoid it entirely, beating and running around a space that shouldn't have been dry at all, as if even the weather understood the thing crouched there didn't belong to the same world the rest of Aimgakure did. He drew a kunai on instinct before his conscious mind had finished cataloging why, and the shadow was already gone by the time steel would have reached it. Sunk back into the ground without a ripple, without a sound, without leaving behind anything he could report except the absolute certainty that something had been there and had wanted him to know it. He reported it anyway. Konan didn't ask him to embellish it and didn't dismiss it either, which told him everything about how seriously she was already taking things she hadn't said out loud yet. "Zetsu," she said when he'd finished, "not the first sighting won't be the last." "It wasn't fighting me," Isamu said. "It could have. I turned my back on it for half a second reaching for my kunai and it just let me, like it wasn't there to fight anybody yet. It wasn't." Konan's expression had gone somewhere Isamu had learned to recognize as calculation rather than fear, though the two had started looking increasingly similar on her lately. It was counting, same as the 2 attacks on the wall. Somebody's building a very precise picture of exactly what we can survive before they decide it's worth the cost of finding out for real. How long before that decision gets made? I don't know. She looked out at the rain, at the reinforced stretch of wall holding steady against weather that had never once managed to hurt it. "But I'd stop calling this the quiet part if I were you." Naruto found them still talking when he arrived, drawn by the specific quality of silence that meant something serious had already been said before he got there. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough that I don't think guessing helps anyone," Konan said. "Bad enough that I'd like to stop finding out exactly how bad at the rate we currently are." She looked between the two of them. "We reinforce what we can. We stop pretending this is still a maybe. And we ask for anything else we can reasonably get, because whatever's coming, I don't think it's coming to test us a 4th time." "I might have an idea about that last part," Naruto said. Naruto wrote the letter 3 times before he let himself send it, which was 2 more drafts than he usually bothered with for anything that didn't involve official paperwork. Gaara, the final version read, considerably shorter than the 2 he'd crumpled before it. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know up front that I'm not asking as a Leaf Shinobi and I'm not asking on behalf of the Hokage. I'm asking as your friend about something I've been doing that could get me thrown in prison if the wrong person decided to make an example out of it." He told him all of it. Nagato, the promise, Konan, the accord, Root, the wall. The thing that had apparently started watching from the tree line at night. He described the aqueduct, and Isamu, and a kid named Ren who talked his way into evacuation training through sheer stubbornness. Because he wanted Gaara to understand this wasn't an abstraction, wasn't a strategic position on a map. It was actual people who decided to try trusting each other again after every reason in the world had taught them not to. He didn't ask for soldiers. He didn't ask Suna to take a public position that would cost Gaara anything he couldn't afford to spend. He asked, in the end, for exactly one thing, that if Rain called for help and nobody else in the world answered, Suna wouldn't be the reason the silence was total. Gaara read it twice in his office before he set it down. which Temery had learned over the years to recognize as the specific kind of quiet that meant her brother was thinking about something that actually mattered instead of something merely urgent. "Well?" she asked eventually, when the silence had gone on longer than her patience for silence generally allowed. Kankuro, leaning in the doorway because he'd wandered past and gotten curious enough to stay, raised an eyebrow. "That's serious. Read it yourself." Gara handed the letter across without hesitation, which told Temery more about how much weight he'd already assigned it than anything he could have said out loud. "He's rebuilding a village that spent years being everyone else's battlefield," Gara said, while his siblings read, "into something that answers to itself instead of whoever's strongest that week." He looked at the letter a moment longer. "I know something about what that costs. I know something about what it's worth once it's actually built." He set it down at last, decision already settled somewhere Temery couldn't see the workings of. Draft a response. Suna makes no public statement, takes no official position, and commits no forces. I won't hand Danzo or anyone else in this world a reason to call it provocation. But if word ever reaches us that Aimgakure is under attack and asking for anyone willing to come, I want a response team already packed and ready to move before the message finishes being read to me. Temery studied her brother for a moment. "That's a lot of risk for a village we have no formal relationship with." "It's not for the village." Gara's voice was quiet, certain, carrying the specific weight of someone who had spent a long time learning exactly what it cost to be trusted after a life spent being feared. "It's for the fact that somebody looked at a place everyone else had already written off and decided it was worth saving anyway instead of useful enough to conquer. I don't get many chances to bet on that kind of thing paying off. I intend to take this one." Kankuro read the letter over Temery's shoulder, quiet for once, and when he finally looked up, some of his usual smirk had gone missing. "Naruto's an idiot," he said, without much heat in it. "The good kind, the kind that makes the rest of us look bad for not trying half as hard." "Draft the response," Gara said again, and this time neither of his siblings argued. Aimgakure spent the days that followed the way any village spends the time before it knows, with certainty, that something is coming quietly, and not quietly enough. Konan drew up evacuation routes for the youngest and oldest residents. Routes she prayed she'd never need and refused to leave unplanned regardless. Isamu ran drills with every genin and chunin rain still had left, drills that had stopped pretending to be routine training sometime around the second Zetsu sighting. Ren found Naruto during one of those drills, arms crossed, wearing an expression that had clearly been rehearsed. "I want to learn to actually fight," he said, "not just watch the wall from a safe distance like some kid." "You are some kid," Naruto pointed out, not unkindly. "So were you. Probably younger than me, even the first time anybody let you actually matter in a fight." Ren didn't back down, which Naruto was starting to recognize as pretty much his defining trait. "I'm not asking to be on the wall. I'm asking not to be useless if everything goes wrong and somebody needs to get Sora and the little ones out fast. That's not the same as playing ninja." Naruto studied him for a long moment and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't have a good argument against it. "Okay," he said finally, "not combat, evacuation drills, fast routes, how to keep your head when everything's loud and on fire. That's it, deal." Ren said, with the particular seriousness of someone who understood exactly how much he was actually being trusted with and intended to earn every bit of it. Sora, a few feet away, didn't say anything, the way she often didn't. But she'd stopped humming while she folded paper that week. Konan noticed and started folding something that looked, unmistakably and with grim, careful precision, like the same explosive tags the genin practiced with under supervision. Nobody had taught her that shape on purpose. She'd simply been watching long enough to learn it anyway. The probing continued for another 6 days, each incident a little less careful about being noticed than the one before it, as though whoever was watching had stopped needing to hide the fact that they were, and had started, instead, wanting Rain to feel exactly how closely it was being observed. A Zetsu clone let itself be spotted at the tree line and held perfectly still, watching for the better part of a minute before sinking away. Another pressed a testing hand against a different, unreinforced section of the wall. The message unmistakable. A reminder that not every stone in Aimgakure carried the same protection the eastern stretch did. On the fourth night, one of them didn't retreat at all until a patrol closed to within 20 feet. And even then it left slowly, unhurried, the way something leaves a room it fully intends to return to. By the fifth day, the village had stopped pretending the sightings were rare enough to dismiss. Vendors in the market district started closing early. A mother in the western district, 2 children in tow, asked Konan directly whether it was time to leave. And Konan, who had spent 2 months learning to answer almost anything without flinching, found she didn't have a good answer that wasn't also a lie. On the 6th night, Isamu's patrol found something worse than a sighting. 3 dead rabbits arranged in a neat, deliberate line along the tree line, throats cut with a precision no predator bothered with. It wasn't a threat aimed at anyone's safety. It was a threat aimed at everyone's nerves, and it worked exactly as well as it was designed to. Naruto felt each report land like a held breath nobody was allowed to let out. He kept the Accord active on rotation now, sections of it live at all times instead of only during tests, which meant a fatigue that had started to feel less like tiredness and more like a debt quietly accruing interest. Kurama had noticed. Kurama noticed everything eventually. "You're spending more than you're resting," the voice noted, one night, with something that might almost have been concern if concern were a thing it still bothered pretending not to feel. "That is not sustainable indefinitely, Jinchuriki, regardless of how noble you've convinced yourself the cause is." "I know," Naruto said into the dark. "I just need it to hold a little longer." "Long enough for what? You should know," Kurama added when Naruto didn't answer right away, "that whatever comes for that wall next will not be interested in testing it politely a 4th time. Whoever is behind this has finished gathering information. What comes after information, in my experience, is always considerably less patient." "Yeah," Naruto said, "kinda got that impression myself." He didn't have a clean answer for that question at all. Not really. Except that somewhere beyond Rain's borders, something patient and ancient and entirely certain of its own purpose had finished watching and started at last to move. Abaito gathered what he needed on a morning with no rain in it at all, which felt, to anyone who might have been watching, like its own kind of omen, as though even the sky over Rain Country understood that whatever was coming next didn't belong to it anymore. He'd chosen the timing deliberately. Not dawn, which invited the kind of dramatic symbolism he had long since stopped caring to perform for an audience of nobody. Not deep night either, when a village on edge would be watching hardest. Midday, when routine still had enough of a grip on people's attention to buy him the extra minutes that mattered, when the changing of a watch or the start of a market shift meant 100 small distractions doing his reconnaissance for him for free. It wasn't an army. It didn't need to be. A handful of Zetsu clones, enough to test a defense from multiple directions at once. His own strength, held in reserve the way it always was until the moment it stopped needing to be. And patience, spent all the way down to its last coin, because patience had done everything patience was capable of doing. And what remained now was simply a matter of taking what he had waited too long to take. He didn't hate the boy for making this necessary. Hatred required a kind of investment he'd stopped affording most things a long time ago. He simply intended to finish what he'd come for, the way he intended to finish everything eventually, and if a fortress built on paper and borrowed fire happened to be standing in the way of that particular door, well, doors, in his considerable experience, tended to open eventually, one way or another. Behind him, the pale shapes that would reach Aimgakure's border by nightfall began, without a sound, to move. In Aimgakure, nobody yet knew to call this the last quiet afternoon they would have for a while. That was, Abaito reflected, very much the point of choosing it. Aimgakure's bells hadn't rung in earnest since the day Pain died. They rang now, and everyone in the village old enough to remember what that sound used to mean stopped whatever they were doing and reached for a weapon, a child, or both. Konan heard them from what used to be her office, and felt something in her chest go very quiet and very still. Not fear, exactly, though it wore fear's shape closely enough that she'd stopped bothering to tell the two apart. 2 months of pipe fixing and paper flowers and careful, patient trust-building distilled down, in the space of a single toll, to the only question that had ever actually mattered: whether any of it would still be standing by morning. She was moving before the second bell finished, chakra already gathering, 2 months of preparation collapsing into the specific, narrow focus of a woman who had done this kind of arithmetic before, and had never once enjoyed getting better at it. Isamu was already moving before the second toll finished, barking positions at Jenin, who drilled this exact scenario so many times in the last week that their bodies answered before their minds fully caught up to what was happening. Eiko and Kotaro took the eastern approach, the same stretch they'd tested with fire 2 weeks earlier, now doing it for real. 3 more shinobi Isamu had personally trained past the point of usefulness took the gate. He kept 2 in reserve, because a man who'd survived 30 years of wars had learned that the plan you started with was never the plan you finished with. Ren found Sora exactly where he expected to, in the warehouse that had stopped being a home for orphans and started being, temporarily, a staging point for children who needed somewhere to be that wasn't outside. "Evacuation Route 2, he said, already moving, voice steadier than he felt. "Same as we drilled. Small ones first, oldest kids at the back. Nobody stops to grab anything that isn't a person." Sora fell in step beside him without a word, one hand full of paper scraps she hadn't let go of even in the scramble. And Ren decided, in the part of his mind that wasn't currently occupied with counting heads, that he'd ask her about that later, if there was a later to ask about. The first wave hit the eastern wall exactly where the fire test had happened, which told Isamu, before a single blow landed, that whoever was running this attack had done their homework thoroughly enough to know precisely which stretch of stone to respect and which to simply route around. They weren't Zetsu, not these, human or human enough, moving with a blank, borrowed competence that reminded Isamu uncomfortably of the 3 root operatives from weeks earlier, except considerably more numerous and considerably less interested in staying alive to be questioned afterward. Cannon fodder, thrown at the wall to see what held and what didn't, spent without hesitation by whoever was directing them from somewhere Isamu couldn't see yet. The wall held. That much, at least, the last 2 months had bought them. What hadn't been bought and couldn't be was the fact that a wall holding didn't stop bodies from coming over it, around it, through gaps a fire jutsu had never needed to make when a person could simply climb. "Hold the line, don't chase," Isamu shouted, taking the head off the nearest attacker with the flat economy of a man who'd stopped finding violence remarkable a long time ago. "We're not here to win the whole fight in the first 5 minutes. We're here to still be standing in the last 5. Eiko fought like she'd been born furious and had simply been waiting for a legitimate reason to show it. Fire technique after fire technique, scorching a clear kill zone in front of the gate. Kotaro covered her blind spots without being asked, the specific wordless coordination of 2 genin who'd spent every free hour of the last 2 weeks training for a day they'd hoped wouldn't come and had shown up for anyway. Rain's shinobi corps was small. It was not any longer soft. Isamu learned exactly how not soft it had become when 3 attackers converged on him at once, timed well enough that ducking the first blow put him directly in the path of the second. He was already resigned to the hit landing when Kotaro's kunai took the second attacker in the throat from an angle Isamu hadn't had time to account for. The same boy Isamu had once thought too green to trust with anything sharper than a broom. Now buying his teacher a half-second that turned out to be exactly the half-second he needed. "Don't get used to me needing the help," Isamu said, breathing hard, already moving again. "Wasn't planning on it," Kotaro said, and meant unmistakably the opposite. Ren felt the ground shudder through the warehouse floor and didn't stop moving, because Naruto, the actual, weeks of drilling Naruto, not some abstract idea of a hero, had told him exactly what to do if that happened, and panicking hadn't been on the list. Left tunnel, he said, herding the smallest two toward the gap in the foundation Konan had shown him personally. Not the main road. Main roads for people who can fight were not those people today. A shape peeled itself out of the shadow at the tunnel mouth before they reached it, not fully formed, not yet, a smear of white and black testing the air the way Isamu had described the thing at the tree line testing him weeks ago. Ren's stomach dropped somewhere near his shoes. He didn't have a jutsu. He didn't have a weapon worth the name. What he had was a smoke pellet Isamu had pressed into his hand 2 days ago, just in case, and the specific, furious clarity of someone who had decided a long time ago that he was done losing people to things he couldn't fight. He threw it, hard, directly at the half-formed shape, and didn't wait to see what it did before shoving both children through the gap and following them into the dark, heart slamming against his ribs the entire way. Behind him, he heard the shape hiss in something that might have been irritation, and didn't come after them at all. It hadn't been sent to chase children through tunnels. It had bigger orders than that. Sora, 3 steps ahead of him in the tunnel, still hadn't let go of the paper in her hand. Obito found Konan exactly where he expected to, on the wall's inner walkway, directing the defense with the same flat, exhausted competence she'd been running this village on for 2 months, and didn't bother with an announcement before he attacked. Announcements were for people who still needed the moment to feel significant. She turned in time to see him. She did not turn in time to stop what came next. 100 blades of paper converged on him from every angle her jutsu could reach. The same cage that had ended a root operative's fight in seconds weeks earlier. Precise and merciless and utterly, uselessly wasted on a target that simply wasn't there to be cut. The blades passed through him like he was smoke given the vague suggestion of a shape, and his counterstrike, a kunai she never saw leave whatever pocket of not-quite space he'd pulled it from, opened a shallow line along her forearm before she managed to throw herself backward out of range. You always did rely too heavily on the idea that hitting something requires the something to actually be there, Obito said, in a voice that carried no more heat than a man commenting on weather. I'd hoped 2 months of desperate improvisation might have taught you otherwise. I'm almost disappointed. Konan didn't waste breath answering. She'd learned a long time ago that men like this wanted a reaction more than they wanted a fight, and she had exactly nothing left to spend on giving him one. She threw everything she had instead, walls of paper, blade after blade, an entire arsenal built and rebuilt over 2 months of desperate work, and watched almost all of it pass through him exactly the way the first attack had, because knowing a man could turn intangible and being able to do anything useful about it while he did were, it turned out, 2 very different kinds of knowledge. He closed the distance during her 4th attempt. Casually, the way a man closes a door he's already decided is going to shut regardless of what's in the way. And this time the strike that found her wasn't shallow. She hit the walkway hard enough to lose the breath in her lungs, blood warm against her ribs, and had just enough clarity left to register that this was, very precisely, how Nagato had once described losing to this same man. Not a single dramatic blow, but a slow accumulation of moments where the other side simply wasn't playing by the rules you'd prepared for. He had told her that story once, years ago, in the particular flat voice he used for things that still cost him something to say out loud. She understood it now in a way she'd only ever understood secondhand before tonight. The eyes, Obito said, crouching over her with the mild, unhurried patience of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Where? She didn't answer that either. She was still working out whether she had enough chakra left to make the refusal. Cost him something when a wall of orange light hit him from the side hard enough to send him through the walkway's railing and out into open air. Get away from her, Naruto said, landing between them with more force than the words strictly needed. chakra already boiling gold red at the edges of his vision in a way that meant Kurama hadn't needed to be asked twice. Obito caught himself mid-fall with the same unbothered ease he did everything, resolidifying on a rooftop below with his cloak barely disturbed. Ah, there's the actual problem. He didn't sound alarmed. He sounded, if anything, like a man finally getting to the part of his day he'd been most looking forward to. I confess I was hoping to finish this quietly. I don't suppose you'd consider letting me. Not really my thing, Naruto said, and threw everything he had at him in the next 3 seconds. Rasengan and clones and a chakra-cloaked strike that should have ended most fights on its own. None of it landed. Obito simply wasn't there for any of it, phasing through blow after blow with the same maddening ease he'd shown Konan, and Naruto felt something cold and familiar settle into his stomach. The specific helplessness of throwing everything he had at a problem that didn't care how hard he threw it. This isn't working, he thought, chest heaving, watching Obito reappear a dozen feet away without so much as a scorch mark to show for the exchange. He's not even trying that hard and nothing's landing. Then stop trying to land something, Kurama said, and something in the voice had sharpened into an intensity Naruto hadn't heard from it before, not amused, not contemptuous, genuinely, uncomfortably focused. I can feel him, boy. Even now, even like that. He is not actually gone when he does whatever it is he's doing. He is simply somewhere your fist currently cannot reach. That is not the same thing as not being there at all, and it is not the same thing as being invisible to me. Naruto's mind caught up half a second behind his instincts. The wall, he said, out loud, mostly to himself. The paper, all of it. It's got your chakra threaded all through it. That's not just reinforcement, is it? That's a nervous system Kurama finished with something that might, on another day, have sounded almost like satisfaction. Your paper friend's own words, if I recall correctly. You've spent 2 months building something that can feel. It is currently feeling exactly where that man is standing, phased or not. Use that, or continue swinging at smoke because it makes you feel like you're accomplishing something. Konan felt it the moment Naruto reached for it. A shift in the reinforced sections nearest her, subtle and enormous at once. Like a limb she hadn't known, was numb, suddenly remembering how to feel pain. She looked at the scorched, ordinary-looking stretch of wall 30 feet away and knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with her eyes, exactly where Obito had gone when he'd flickered out of sight a moment ago. There, she said, already moving, paper answering her before the word finished leaving her mouth. Obito rematerialized precisely where he intended to, behind Naruto, blade already drawn. The exact ambush that had ended every fight he'd ever needed to end this way. Directly into a wall of vermilion-threaded paper that had been waiting for him since before he'd finished phasing back into the world at all. It didn't stop him. He was fast enough, even taken by surprise, to twist half his body back into that not-quite space before the strike fully landed. But half a body was not a full one, and the blade that should have opened Naruto's throat caught nothing but air, and the paper that should have passed through him harmlessly instead caught the trailing edge of a cloak that hadn't finished dematerializing in time. For the first time since the fight began, Obito went still. Not injured, not even inconvenienced in any way that mattered, but still, in the specific way of a man recalculating an assumption that had just proven considerably less reliable than he'd built an entire strategy around. That, he said, is new. Yeah, Naruto said, breathing hard, feeling the cost of what he'd just done settle into his chest like a stone dropped down a well with no bottom he could see. Get used to it. He tried again, almost immediately, phasing out mid-lunge and reappearing above them where no defense should reasonably have already been waiting. And found one anyway, a curtain of paper unfurling into the exact space he'd chosen a fraction of a second before he chose it, forcing him to abort the strike and phase out again before he'd even finished materializing. Twice more he tried variations on the same idea, faster each time, angrier in the specific quiet way that didn't show on his face but showed everywhere else. in how much less casual his movements had become, in how much more of his attention was clearly going toward finding an angle the wall's borrowed awareness hadn't already accounted for. He didn't find one. Not because Konan and Naruto were reacting faster than he was moving, they weren't, not even close, but because they had stopped needing to react at all. They were simply already there, every time the way a shore is already there for a wave that thinks it's arriving somewhere new. The tide didn't turn all at once. It turned the way a fight always actually turns, in 100 small readjustments instead of one dramatic reversal. Obito's ambushes arriving a half-second later than they needed to. His retreats into intangibility bought at the cost of accomplishing nothing while he was there. Konan and Naruto no longer reacting to where he'd been, but preempting where the wall's borrowed nervous system told them he was about to be. It cost them. Every correction, every preemptive strike ran through Naruto first. The same conscious, continuous act of asking rather than taking that had built the accord in the first place, except now stretched across an entire battle instead of a single test. And he could feel the debt of it accumulating somewhere behind his sternum with every passing minute. A fatigue that had stopped being merely uncomfortable and started, quietly, to frighten him. "You are close to the edge of what I would consider wise," Kurama said once in the half-second lull between exchanges. "Closer than I would like to be honest about." "Noted," Naruto said. "Kinda busy right now." Obito adapted because men like him always did, shortening his phases, striking faster, forcing more corrections in less time specifically to bleed Naruto dry before either side found an actual resolution. It was, Naruto understood with a distant, exhausted clarity, working. Not quickly, but working. Then, from somewhere beyond the eastern gate, a new set of chakra signatures arrived that didn't belong to Rain at all. And for the first time all night, Obito's timing faltered. Shikamaru hadn't waited for permission, exactly. He'd waited for a pattern serious enough that permission became a formality nobody had time to argue about. And the moment Naruto's warning clone had dispersed in the mission office with a memory of Zetsu activity thick enough to choke on. He'd had a team moving within the hour, small, deniable. Exactly the kind of quiet gesture Tsunade could claim not to have explicitly authorized if anyone official ever asked her to. They hit the eastern flank hard, fast, and precisely where Isamu's exhausted line needed the relief most. And if it wasn't the difference between winning and losing, it was very much the difference between winning slowly and winning in time to matter. Isamu spared the newcomers exactly one assessing glance before deciding they were competent enough not to need supervising. "Leaf," he said to Shikamaru, in a tone that had considerably less hostility in it than the last time he'd said the word out loud. "Figured you might need a hand." Shikamaru took in the scale of what he'd walked into with the flat, rapid calculation of someone already 3 moves past the introductions. "You've got the gate. We'll thin the ones trying to flank around the south wall before they get any ideas about the parts you haven't reinforced yet." Troublesome wasn't a word Isamu had ever used before, but he found himself thinking it anyway, watching the Leaf team fold into the defense with an efficiency that made 2 months of desperate improvisation look, for one grudging moment, almost professional. "Troublesome," Shikamaru said, out loud, taking in the same scale from the opposite direction, and got to work anyway. The reinforcements bought Konan exactly what she needed. A handful of seconds where nobody required her attention except the man in front of her. She rose to her full height on the walkway, chakra pouring out of her in a controlled flood that had nothing left to hide and nothing left to conserve, and let the transformation take her the way it hadn't needed to in months. Paper unfolding from her shoulders and spine in great sweeping arcs, wings assembling feather by feather until she stood taller than the wall itself, vast and terrible, and for the first time threaded through every visible edge with a deep, banked vermilion that hadn't existed in this technique before tonight. "Naruto," she said, and didn't need to say anything else. He found the last of what he had scraping past exhaustion into the specific, narrow place beyond it where willpower did the work chakra no longer could, and looked, for 1/2 second, at exactly how little was left to give. Kurama was there before he finished asking. No negotiation left to have, no terms to renegotiate under fire. Just a vast, ancient presence meeting him halfway with something that felt, disorientingly, almost like eagerness. Careful, Kurama said, even as the chakra poured through, is a word for later. Right now, take what you need. I'll tell you if you're about to kill yourself doing it. Thanks, Naruto managed, and poured everything remaining into the wings taking shape above him. The feathers didn't fall so much as arrive. 1,000 of them, and then more, filling the sky over Aimgakure like something between a blizzard and a judgment, each one carrying enough of that borrowed, resonant awareness to know exactly where Obito was and exactly where he was about to be. He tried to phase through the first wave, the way he'd phased through everything else all night, and found himself already boxed by the second wave before the first had finished passing through the space where he used to be. An encirclement that didn't care how many times he made himself briefly not exist, because it had never needed him solid to know precisely where he was hiding. He tried a different angle. The wings were already there. He tried retreating outright, a full phase shift meant to put real distance between himself and the technique entirely, and discovered, for the first time all night, that resonance didn't have a maximum range the way a fist did. That the feathers didn't need to catch him so much as simply never lose track of him, patient as weather, closing the gap he'd opened by inches he couldn't spare. He was forced to choose, finally, between vanishing entirely, abandoning the fight, the eyes, the entire reason he'd come, disappearing into that not-quite space, and simply never coming back tonight, or rematerializing fully to fight his way out through brute force while there was still enough of a fight left to win. For the first time all night, Obito hesitated, and the hesitation cost him the last half-second he had to spend. The sovereign's 1,000 wings, Konan said, and the sky came down around him. It wasn't a single strike. It was 1,000 small ones arriving at once, precise enough to avoid the walkway, the wall, everything Aimgakure needed to still be standing in the morning, and utterly without mercy toward the one thing standing in the middle of all of it that wasn't. Obito rematerialized fully at the last possible instant, forced into it, cornered into it, exactly the way the wall's nervous system had known he eventually would be, and took the technique's full weight across a body that had run out of places left to not quite be. He got out. Naruto understood, even through the haze of his own exhaustion, that a man like Obito always got out, that the entire fight had been, from his side of it, a cost-benefit calculation from the very first strike, and a fight that had turned this expensive this fast. Against reinforcements he hadn't accounted for, simply stopped being worth whatever remained to win. He tore a hole in the world wide enough to vanish through, bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts that would heal before morning and costing considerably more pride than blood, and paused, for just a moment, on the threshold of wherever he was going. "This isn't finished," he said to Konan, to Naruto, to the wall and the village and the whole stubborn, improbable fact of Aimgakure still standing behind him. "You've bought yourselves time, nothing more permanent than that. Maybe," Naruto said, swaying on his feet, refusing to go down before the other man was fully gone. "But you're leaving without them. That's not nothing." Something in Obito's stillness suggested, more clearly than words could have, that this particular fact bothered him more than anything else that had happened all night. Then he was gone, and the sky over Aimgakure, for the first time in hours, had nothing left in it but rain. Naruto's knees found the walkway before he decided to let them. Konan was there before he finished falling, her transformation already unwinding back into something closer to human, arms catching more of his weight than either of them would ever fully admit to out loud afterward. "Hey," he said, distant and slurring at the edges. "We held it! We held it!" she agreed. Around them, the sounds of a battle winding down replaced the sounds of one still being fought. Isamu's voice somewhere below, hoarse and furious and alive, accounting for his people one exhausted name at a time. Shikamaru's team moving through the aftermath with the brisk, unglamorous efficiency of people who understood that the fight wasn't actually over until every wounded person had been found. And underneath all of it, smaller and easier to miss, the sound of children being led back up out of a tunnel by a boy who'd kept every single one of them alive without ever once needing to throw a punch. Isamu climbed the walkway stairs slower than he wanted to, favoring a leg he'd deal with properly once there was time to, and looked at the two of them for a long moment without saying anything at all. "Everyone's accounted for," he said finally. "Too serious, nobody dead. Considering what came over that wall tonight, I'll take it." "Too serious" landed heavier than the flat way he'd said it, and Naruto felt it land, filing the cost away somewhere he'd have to actually sit with later, once his body stopped demanding all his attention just to keep breathing. "Go get looked at," Konan told him. "That's an order, not a suggestion." "Wasn't planning on arguing," Isamu said, which from him was practically surrender, and went. Ren found them not long after, Sora's hand still in his, and stopped a few feet away when he saw the state Naruto was in. "You look terrible," he said, which from him was practically an expression of concern. "Feel terrible," Naruto admitted. "Feel pretty good about the terrible, though." Sora let go of Ren's hand and came the rest of the way alone, small and soaked through, and entirely undeterred by the blood and exhaustion in front of her. She held out what was left in her other hand, 6 or 7 paper tags, carefully folded, that Naruto recognized with a tired jolt as the same explosive tag shape Konan had never actually taught her. "For if you need them later," Sora said, the most words Naruto had ever heard her use at once, and pressed them into his palm before anyone could tell her she shouldn't have made them at all. Naruto looked down at 6 small, deadly serious paper folds sitting in his exhausted hand, made by a girl who'd been too traumatized to speak 3 months ago, and found, despite everything the night had cost him, that he was smiling. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than the moment strictly required. Above them, for the first time in longer than anyone standing on that wall could easily remember, the rain began, very slightly, to ease. Rain still fell on Aimgakure, because rain always did. But 3 days after Obito vanished through a tear in the world he hadn't managed to fill with anything except failure, it had started, almost imperceptibly, to feel less like grief and more like just weather. The wounded were healing. Isamu's leg had turned an alarming shade of purple that Konan assured him was cosmetic, and Isamu clearly didn't believe for a second, though he'd stopped arguing about it after the second time she'd threatened to have him carried to the infirmary personally. The 2 serious injuries from the siege, a genin with a collapsed lung, an older shinobi who'd taken a blade meant for someone half his age, were both, against odds nobody had wanted to say out loud, expected to recover fully. Nobody had died. In a village that had spent years measuring its losses in bodies, that fact alone had a way of making people stop in the street and simply breathe for a moment before continuing wherever they'd been going. Naruto slept for the better part of 2 days after the fight, the kind of sleep that had nothing performative about it, and woke up ravenous, useless for anything requiring fine chakra control, and alive in a way that felt, for the first morning in longer than he could remember. Entirely uncomplicated, he found Isamu on the second day, propped against a doorframe with his bad leg stretched out in front of him, scowling at nothing in particular. "You're supposed to be resting," Naruto said. "So are you." Isamu didn't open his eyes. "Difference is, I'm actually doing it. You're standing there talking instead." Naruto sat down against the opposite wall, close enough to talk without needing to raise his voice, and let the silence stretch for a while before either of them bothered filling it. "Been meaning to ask," he said eventually. "Back at the start. You told me first sign I was here for anything other than what Konan said, you'd put me in the ground yourself. I remember." We anywhere close to that yet? Isamu was quiet long enough that Naruto started to wonder if he'd misjudged how far they'd actually come. No, he said finally, gruff in the specific way that meant the honesty cost him something. Not close. Not for a while now, if I'm being straight with you, which I generally am, whether people want me to be or not. He shifted his weight, wincing. My brother would have hated you on principle. Leaf headband, loud mouth, the whole package. I think he would have come around eventually the same way I did. Slower, probably. He was stubborn. Something flickered across his scarred face that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from one either. I don't say that to a lot of people. Don't get used to it. Wouldn't dream of it, Naruto said, and meant it. Word travels fast when the story is good, and faster still when it's true. It reached Iwa first, filtered through the same scouts who'd spent weeks testing Rain's border without ever quite committing to anything. A fortified village, backed by unknown allies, had repelled what intelligence circles were already calling an Akatsuki remnant strike without losing a single defender. The Tsuchikige's response, relayed secondhand through channels Isamu's own intelligence network only partially trusted, amounted to a single, grudging directive. Pull back the scouts and find somewhere else to look for easy territory. Rain, whatever it had become, had stopped being worth the risk of finding out the hard way. It reached Kirigakure as little more than a rumor, and stayed that way, which suited Konan fine. Not every nation needed to have an opinion about Aimgakure yet. Some of them just needed to stop actively planning around its collapse. Closer to home, it reached the parts of Aimgakure that had never fully believed any of this would last. The vendors who'd started closing early during the worst of the probing weeks. The families who'd quietly begun drawing up their own private evacuation plans, regardless of what Konan's official ones said. Word that the wall had held, that the thing everyone had been dreading had come and gone and left the village standing, moved through the market district faster than any official announcement could have managed. Konan overheard, on her second morning back at the aqueduct's inspection routine, a vendor telling another that Aimgakure had actually held this time, in a tone that suggested the speaker had genuinely not expected to be saying those words out loud in her lifetime. It reached Sunagakure exactly as fast as a promise travels when the person who made it meant every word, which was how, 4 days after the siege ended, a small, dust-covered Sooner response team arrived at Aimgakure's eastern gate, having traveled harder and faster than strictly reasonable, only to find the fight they'd raced to join already finished without them. Their captain looked faintly embarrassed about it. Konan didn't let her be. You came anyway, Konan said, meeting them personally at the gate. That's not nothing, arriving late to a fight you were never obligated to join in the first place. Kazekage-sama's orders were specific, the captain said. Come regardless of timing, arrive fast enough to matter or arrive slow enough to help clean up. Either one still counted as keeping the promise. Konan looked past her, toward the horizon in the general direction of Suna, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she believed it completely. Tsunade arrived 6 days after that, with considerably less fanfare than the moment technically deserved and considerably more security than she'd have preferred. Shikamaru at her shoulder the entire way, looking like a man who had personally vetted every square inch of the route twice. She found Naruto on the reinforced stretch of wall, one hand resting against stone that no longer needed his active attention to hold its shape. Konan had explained, with visible relief, that the accord seemed to settle into something more permanent the longer it held under real strain. Less a wound that needed constant tending and more a scar that had finally finished healing into something load-bearing. He wasn't required there, he'd simply gotten into the habit of checking anyway. Hokage-sama, he said, straightening. Don't, Tsunade said, waving it off. Not today. Today I'm not here as your Hokage. I'm here because Jiraiya spent half his life trying to drag a piece like this out of exactly this village, and dying without knowing whether any of it stuck was the closest thing to genuine regret I ever heard him admit to. She looked out over the wall, at a village that was, undeniably, still standing. I wanted to see it myself before I made anything official, some things you don't get to just read in a report. She was quiet for a moment, taking in the scarred, vermilion-threaded stone under her palm when she touched it, the market district visible beyond the wall with more open stalls than Naruto remembered from his very first clones report months ago. "It's strange," she admitted. "I spent so long thinking of this place as the wound that killed my teammate by degrees. Watching him fail here over and over until it finally broke something in him he never got back. I don't know what to do with a version of Rain that isn't that anymore. I'm not sure I've fully finished being angry that it took you, of all people, to manage it." "I had help," Naruto said. "Lots of it wasn't just me." "I know. That's rather the point I'm making, brat, if you'd let me finish." She almost smiled, the expression sitting oddly on a face that had spent the last several months mostly arranging itself around worry and paperwork. "Jiraiya used to say peace was never going to come from one person being strong enough to force it. He said it would come from enough people deciding, independently and stubbornly, that trusting each other was worth the risk of being wrong about it. I used to think that was the most naive thing he ever told me, and he told me a lot of naive things." She looked at the village again. "I'm less sure now." The formal recognition, when it came that afternoon, was shorter than Naruto expected and heavier than he'd been ready for. A document bearing the Land of Fire's seal alongside Konoha's, recognizing Aimgakure as a sovereign village, entitled to conduct its own affairs. Protected under an informal but explicit understanding that unprovoked aggression against it would be regarded, by Konoha at least, as a matter of genuine concern rather than distant curiosity. It didn't mention the Vermilion Accord by name. It didn't need to. Everyone in the room reading it understood exactly what had made this particular piece of paper possible. "I'm not doing this because I'm no longer angry you didn't tell me sooner," Tsunade told Konan, signing it anyway. "I'm doing it because a stable, independent, grateful neighbor is worth infinitely more to Konoha than a resentful protectorate. And because I watched a village everyone else had already buried decide, entirely on its own, not to stay dead. That's not something you get to formalize very often. I intend to enjoy formalizing it." "Thank you," Konan said, and meant considerably more by it than the two words strictly carried. "Don't thank me. Thank the idiot who apparently can't walk past someone drowning without jumping in fully clothed." Tsunade's eyes found Naruto, something warm and exasperated and entirely without reservation in the look. "Try to give me a little more warning next time you decide to reshape regional politics on a whim, would you?" "No promises," Naruto said, and for once, nobody in the room doubted him. Shikamaru, hanging back near the door through the entire exchange, caught Naruto's eye on the way out and shook his head with the particular fondness he reserved for things he found simultaneously ridiculous and impossible to argue with. "Still can't believe this actually worked," he said. "For what it's worth, I'm glad it did. Don't make a habit of the reckless part, though. My blood pressure's not built for a repeat." "No promises there either," Naruto said, grinning, and Shikamaru's answering sigh sounded, unmistakably, like a man who'd expected exactly that answer and hadn't really been hoping for a different one. Danzo received the news the way he received most disappointments, without visible reaction, filed away for later use rather than argued against in a room where arguing would accomplish nothing. "Formal recognition," Hamura said, setting the document down between them in the privacy of a room that appeared on no floor plan. "That closes the door on any future claim of jurisdiction, informal or otherwise. It closes one door." Danzo's tone carried no particular disappointment in it, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than if it had. "There will be others. Sovereign villages still require intelligence. Intelligence still requires eyes. I find I am simply required to be more patient about how I place them going forward." He considered the map on the wall a moment longer. Rain country no longer the damp, dismissible smear it once was, but something else now, contested, valuable, and, for the moment, simply out of reach. Patience has never once cost me anything I wasn't willing to spend. He did not mention that his intelligence mandate over Aimgakure remained, technically, still revoked. He did not need to. Everyone in the room already understood how much weight that technicality was likely to carry, going forward, against a man who had never once let a formal boundary interrupt an informal ambition. Konan found Naruto alone that evening, on the same stretch of wall, watching a sunset that had actually managed to break through the clouds for the first time in longer than either of them could accurately remember. "I have something for you," she said, and held out a small, careful bundle wrapped in cloth before he could ask what. Inside was a fragment of metal, no larger than a coin, etched with the unmistakable curve of Aimgakure's own symbol worn nearly smooth. A piece of the forehead protector Nagato had stopped wearing long before he became something the world called pain. Kept, Naruto understood without being told, because Konan had never been able to make herself throw away anything that had once belonged to either of the two boys she'd loved and outlived. "I kept the rest," she said, before he could ask. "This piece I want you to have. Not because I'm finished grieving him, I don't think I ever will be, not completely. But because he spent his last honest breath betting on you, and I think he'd want proof, somewhere out in the world, that the bet paid off." She looked at him for a long moment. Yahiko believed people could choose each other on purpose, instead of being born or ranked or frightened into loyalty. Nagato believed it too, right at the very end, after believing the opposite for most of his life. "I'd like there to be something solid in the world that remembers both of those beliefs turned out to be true." Naruto closed his hand around the fragment, feeling the worn metal edge press into his palm, and found he didn't have a joke ready for once, didn't want one. "I'll keep it safe," he said instead. "I promise. I know you will." Something in Konan's expression, tired and rain-soaked and entirely unguarded, came as close to a real smile as Naruto had ever seen on her. "You're rather good at keeping those, as it turns out." 2 weeks later, in a courtyard that had been rubble the last time anyone had bothered giving it a name, Konan stood in front of 6 children, Ren and Sora among them. Along with 4 others, the siege had left with even less than they'd had before, and taught them the first fold Jiraiya had ever taught her, decades and 2 lifetimes ago, in the ruins of a war that hadn't been kind enough to end quickly. "This isn't a weapon," she told them, demonstrating the motion slowly enough for the smallest ones to follow. "Not yet. It's just paper. What it becomes later depends entirely on what you decide to become first." Ren's fold came out crooked, too eager, corners misaligned in his hurry to get it right the first time. He scowled at it the way he scowled at most things that didn't immediately go his way, crumpled it without being told to, and started again. "You don't have to be good at it today," Konan told him, not unkindly. "I know." He didn't look up from the fresh sheet. "Doesn't mean I have to like being bad at it either." Sora's came out perfect on the second attempt, quiet and precise in exactly the way she did most things now, the paper crane sitting in her palm like something that had always belonged there. She held it up for Konan to see, wordless, and Konan felt something in her chest tighten and ease at the same time, watching a girl who'd once gone weeks without speaking hold up proof of what patience and safety, given enough time, could actually build. Again, Konan said, to both of them, to all 6, with the specific patience of a woman who understood, better than anyone alive, exactly how long this kind of teaching actually took, and exactly how much it mattered regardless. Naruto watched from the courtyard's edge, not close enough to intrude, close enough to see it anyway. A woman who had lost every family she'd ever built, building another one anyway, out of exactly the same stubborn refusal to let a good dream die of loneliness that had started this entire improbable chain of events in a crater a lifetime ago. He thought, watching it, that Nagato would have recognized this immediately. It was Yahiko's dream, handed down a second time, to people who hadn't been born into it or chosen it out of desperation, but who'd simply been offered it freely by someone who'd finally learned the difference between the two. He went back to Konoha properly the following week. Not a clone, not a 5-day cover story, but the whole of him, openly, with Tsunade's formal blessing and a mission classification that finally matched what he'd actually been doing for months. It felt strange, walking through the village gate without needing to check whether his story held together first. Stranger still, the number of people who already seemed to know exactly where he'd been and simply hadn't made it his business to explain. Sakura found him at the memorial stone that evening, sitting with his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. "So," she said, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation, "you rebuilt a village, made a treaty with a tailed beast, became some kind of unofficial ambassador, all while I was covering your D-rank paperwork and telling myself you were just tired." "Pretty much, yeah. I'm mad at you." She didn't sound it particularly. "I'm also kind of impressed, which is annoying because I wanted to just be mad." "You can be both," Naruto offered. "I hear people do that all the time." Sakura huffed something that was almost a laugh and let the silence after it sit there comfortably. The way silence only sits between people who have stopped needing to fill every gap in a conversation to prove they still belong in it. Naruto didn't tell her about the fragment of forehead protector he still carried, folded into a cloth in his jacket pocket. Some things he was learning didn't need to be explained to be understood. Abaito received the reports from a considerable distance, in a place with no rain in it at all, and allowed himself exactly one moment of something that might, in a more honest man, have been called frustration, before folding it away with everything else he no longer had use for. The eyes remained out of reach. Formal recognition meant Konoha's quiet backing had become considerably less quiet, which meant a second direct strike would now carry a cost he was no longer certain the timeline could absorb. Every path he had built toward Madara's return had assumed a reign too broken to matter. That assumption was, as of 3 weeks ago, no longer available to him. He considered, briefly, whether the boy's involvement had been predictable, whether some earlier version of the plan should have accounted for a Jinchuriki who kept insisting on turning enemies into allies through sheer, exhausting persistence. He decided, in the end, that it didn't matter whether it had been predictable, only whether it was solvable, and everything in his experience was eventually solvable, given enough patience and enough alternate paths still left untried. He would find another way. He always did. Plans, in his experience, were rarely destroyed so much as delayed, and delay was simply patience wearing a less comfortable name. There were other Jinchuriki, other tools, other doors that hadn't yet had the misfortune of a stubborn, orange-clad complication standing in front of them. "You've gotten in my way exactly once, Jinchuriki," he thought. Toward a village he could no longer walk into unannounced, toward a boy who had somehow turned a dying enemy into an alliance strong enough to cost him an entire strategy. "Let's see how many more times your luck holds before something finally runs out, the village or yours." Behind him, in the dark, something patient and old began, once again, to wait. In Aimgakure, the rain kept falling, the way it always had and likely always would. But for the first time in longer than the village's oldest residents could accurately remember, it fell on a place that had chosen, deliberately and against every reasonable expectation, exactly who it wanted to become. Not a weapon aimed by whoever held it tightest. Not a battlefield borrowed by nations too large to notice the cost, but a sovereign dawn built by people who had decided, one stubborn act of trust at a time, that loyalty chosen was worth infinitely more than loyalty owed. It wasn't finished. Konan understood that as well as anyone standing on that wall. Abaito was still out there, patient and undeterred, and the world beyond Rain's borders remained exactly as complicated as it had been the day Nagato's hand went still in her own. But the wall was standing. The children were learning to fold something that wasn't a weapon yet. And somewhere between a promise made to a dying man and a fragment of forehead protector now carried by the boy who'd kept it, something had taken root in the wreckage that no amount of rain was ever going to wash away again.